We proceed. I'll do the land acknowledgement, but I can't find it. So I'm going to acknowledge that the land upon which we are gathered this evening is the traditional territory of the Adirondack, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe people. We have an obligation to recognize their presence here, their care of the land, and we have a responsibility to be good stewards of the land in cooperation with the Indigenous people, many of whom continue to live in Fort Erie and add to the richness of our community. Madam Clerk, the roll call. Or Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Sorry, it's been so long since we've had, in fact, we had a Mr. Clerk probably 35, 40 years ago maybe. So, Mr. Clerk.
Take us time to get
Mr. Clerk.
No offense taken. All members of council are present, Your Worship.
Thank you. There is no addendum this evening. I've got a few announcements. First has to do with a regional public meeting under the official plan relative to regional road allowances. That meeting will take place Wednesday, September the 13th at 1:30 p.m. as part of the Region's Planning Committee agenda. And it's at the regional headquarters at Campbell West in the council chambers at 815 Sir Isaac Brock Way. It's a public meeting very similar to the public meetings we hold, which permits individuals to address council regarding the proposed changes to the road allowance policies of the region. Second item has to do with today being the annual running of the Rick Schuler Memorial Race. Councillor McDermott and I were there. He got the front end of the horse. I was the hind end of the horse. Councillor Insin was also there. It was a beautiful day, and this is the 9th year since Councillor Schuler passed on. He was a very valuable member of this council, served the town of Fort Erie for over a decade, and grew up in the community. If anyone was one with the community, it would have been Rick Schuler, who really had the pulse of the community. He was just an interesting guy to be around. I used to refer to him as the senator for some reasons that I'll explain at some other time. But I told his wife, Susan, today that whenever I think of Rick, I can't help but smile. I mean, the guy was just one of those people that made you smile. And I know most of you knew him, and so it was a great day. It was a really good race, and the best news of all, his niece Sarah won. She bet on the horse that won, so that was good as well. The next announcement has to do with the Dream Drive. This is the drive where individuals drive from around the west end of Highway 3 into Fort Erie or back, whichever way. There will be an opening for that event on Saturday, September the 15th at 9 a.m. at the Old Fort. And that will be the starting and the ending point for the Dream Drive this year. On September the 18th, I don't think that's right. I think it's the 13th. September the 13th, the Senior Stepping Out event will take place at the Fort Erie Lions Senior Center on High Street. That runs from 1 o'clock until 3 p.m. It's an opportunity for individuals to learn what services are available to seniors in town and to provide comments relative to any issues that they have and things that the Seniors Committee can work on in the future. Tomorrow is the Prince of Wales Stakes in Fort Erie. That's the second jewel in the Canadian Triple Crown. And this race traditionally is the largest event at the Fort Erie racetrack each year. Generally draws large crowds. I'm going to say this year, with the crowds they've been getting, that we could end up with 7,500, 8,000 people at that track, and undoubtedly a large number of bets being placed on the Prince of Wales stake, which currently has, I think, 11 horses entered for tomorrow. So the weather may not be as cooperative as it was today, but we're going to worry about that when we get there. And then finally, for those of you who were here in 2001, you'll know that today is the 22nd anniversary of 9/11 in the United States, and how most of you will know how it's changed our lives. Some may think to the better. I think it took the innocence away from anyone who had any innocence left at the time. The security measures that we now typically take as routine are far beyond what I think any of us would have imagined on September 10th, 2001. But here it is now 22 years later, and the world has changed significantly since then. So I know that across the United States and in Canada there are events taking place to commemorate this anniversary, and it's one that if we can learn anything, let's learn the lessons of 9/11, and let's take advantage of those lessons as we move forward as a society. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? There being none, there are a number of upcoming public meetings. The first one has to do with a proposed regional official plan amendment, which I just mentioned to you tomorrow, September 13th, at the regional headquarters. Second has to do with our 2023 housekeeping amendment. There will be a public meeting on Monday, September the 18th. That's next Monday, 6 o'clock here in the council chambers. The information report from staff will be available on our website by 5 p.m. on Thursday, September 15th, which is this Thursday. There's an open house with respect to a draft plan of vacant land condominium at 3770 Hazel Street, and that open house takes place on Tuesday, September 19th at 5:30 p.m. here in the Atrium Town Hall. Another open house for a proposed combined official plan and zoning bylaw amendment, draft plan of subdivision and draft plan of vacant land condominium relative to 576 Ridge Road North. And that will be on September the 20th, which is a Wednesday, next Wednesday at 5 p.m. here in the atrium at the Town Hall. And finally, an open house on Thursday, September the 21st, with respect to a proposed zoning bylaw amendment, application and draft plan of condominium for 986 Ridge Road South. That will be between the hours of 6 and 7 on September the 21st. That takes us then to this evening's public meeting, which is the town-initiated official plan and zoning bylaw amendments. It is a public meeting under the Planning Act, and anyone who wishes to address council may. The format will be that council will hear from a member of staff. This evening's staff member is Garrett Bourma, who will be providing us with background information relative to Report PDS 59-2023. We will then also be hearing from the consultant with WSP, who, Mr. Bourma, is he going to be speaking first, or are you going to speak first? He'll be speaking first, okay. And then after Mr. Bourma is finished, I will ask if there are any members of the public that wish to address council, and you may come forward. I will ask for your name, address, and then you may speak. For those who are zooming in, I understand that we've got some technical difficulties, and although you won't be able to see members of council or what's going on in the council chamber, I understand that you will be able to see the video presentation, and that you will also be able to speak to council. We will hear you. We may not see you. You won't see us, but I'll be asking Mr. Patton if he can advise us if there's anyone in the digital waiting room that wishes to address us. Before we're finished, I will ask the clerk if we have received any additional comments in writing from members of the public other than what we've already received and which is referred to in the staff report. And then after that's completed, I will close the public meeting. During the course of the presentations and any delegations before council, members of council may ask questions. And then once we're finished with the public meeting, we will move on to PDS 59-2023 to deal with. So, having said that, I'm going to turn this over to staff for, and I take it that Greg is coming by Zoom? Okay. So, Mr. Patton, do you want to bring him into the meeting, please? Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. Can you hear and see me?
We can see you and we can hear you.
Lucky you. If I may proceed, Your Worship?
You may proceed. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Your Worship, and good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here this evening to talk to you again about the town's short-term rental study. I know I've had the honor of being before all of you before in terms of understanding the intent of the project and to seek feedback and to have open houses, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that and to summarize sort of where we've been and where we're going. As mentioned by the mayor, this is a statutory public meeting which represents an opportunity, a formal opportunity for members of the public, for members of council and other stakeholders to ask questions and provide feedback on what is being presented before you this evening. So what I'm aiming to do is talk to you about the overall project and timeline. I know for many of you this is a repeat. You've heard this before, but for those who haven't been involved throughout the process, it's important to understand where we are and where we're going. We'll talk to you a bit about the work program and what we've undertaken in terms of consultation, the recommendations that were proposed back at the end of May, and then where we are now in terms of the proposing the land use approach through an official plan amendment, a zoning bylaw amendment, and what those provisions entail. So currently, the town regulates short-term rentals through a licensing bylaw. However, through planning, there's actually no way of regulating where they might be located or where they might be permitted. That is until the town considers an amendment to their official plan and zoning bylaw, which is why we're here this evening. Council authorized this land use study to develop and assess a land use approach through the Planning Act to determine where short-term rentals should be located. And the only way that short-term rentals are permitted is through amendments to its planning documents, that being the official plan and zoning bylaw. So we're actually at the tail end of this particular program. We started in fall 2022 with research and consultation. We had a number of meetings with stakeholders, including the business community, platform providers, organizations, town departments, community focus group, and certainly members of council. We had a public information open house, and then we sort of concluded that with an initial sort of report that sort of summarized everything that was done to date. We moved into sort of the options assessment phase, which included, again, workshops and really looking for input on some of the options that were developed. We had an open house again to receive feedback. And then we moved into developing recommendations, which we sort of finalized at the May of this year, 2023. That included draft recommendations, a public open house, and a presentation to council. And then we moved into preparing the formal amendment, which is really just taking the recommendations and enacting them or implementing them in the official plan and the zoning bylaw through proposed amendments. And now we are at the statutory public meeting, which is an opportunity, as I mentioned, to receive feedback. And then what we'll do is we'll take that input and then work with staff to sort of finalize this process for consideration by council for approval at a subsequent meeting. So the background included really an understanding of where the town sits in the planning framework in Ontario. So what we did is we looked at other best practices and what other municipalities are doing across the province and even the country, and to help inform the development of land use options. We looked at various policies, including Municipal Act, the Planning Act, the Provincial Growth Plan, Provincial Policy Statement, and other sort of case law through the Ontario Tribunal, Ontario Land Tribunal, formerly called the LPAT or OMB, but they still remain very much intact, and there is case law out there on how short-term rentals have been ruled upon elsewhere in the province. We looked at the Niagara Region official plan, which is currently the governing body for planning in Niagara Region. We also looked at obviously the town's official plan and zoning bylaw, the town's licensing bylaw, as well as, again, as I mentioned, best practices from across the province with respect to generally similar municipalities. What we found is that the province or the region do not provide guidance on short-term rentals. It has been generally left to the municipality, and this is what we found sort of commonly applied throughout the province. The Ontario Land Tribunal has rendered decision on short-term rentals, specifically identifying them as commercial uses, generally where the owner is not present on site. In other municipalities, where they do have provisions, certainly there are municipalities that haven't undertaken a study like this, but where they have provisions in place, they are regulated as commercial uses. And the town doesn't have any sort of policies or regulations in their planning documents to offer guidance on short-term rentals, which is one of the main reasons why they undertook this study. So just sort of in summary of what we've heard. Again, as I mentioned, we attended and sort of organized a number of different sessions, whether they be public open houses, a community focus group. We met with Niagara Regional Police. We met with platform representatives, local business community members, the general public, and also prior and current council members. And I'm not going to go through all 9 points about what we heard, but we've found, and what we heard was that short-term rentals are important for tourism, especially where there's lack of or absent access to hotels or motels. They are generally appropriate in commercial areas. That's what we heard. Certain residential areas, such as the historic area Crystal Beach, may be appropriate for short-term rentals. High concentrations can disrupt the local sense of community, so it's important to look across the entire town. Standalone short-term rentals are generally inappropriate in residential areas because of the fact that the owner is not present on a consistent basis, and again, they have been rendered or ruled by the tribunal as commercial uses. And what we found is that the discussion has been quite polarizing. Some want short-term rentals everywhere, some don't want them at all, and we've heard everything in between. What we've been retained to do is identify short-term rentals and assess them and provide recommendations that are reasonable, that are balanced, and we want to try to achieve all the objectives of the study. So the land use options that were developed and presented at an open house in February of this year, and I won't go through them in great detail because I think many of people have seen these before, and I will talk about them in a bit more detail in subsequent slides, but we sort of developed 4 options or 2 primary options and then sort of another with sort of a subset to it. So permitting short-term rentals in specific zones in the town. So where are they appropriate, perhaps where are they not, and it depends on perhaps access and things of that sort, depending on the particular use. Permitting short-term rentals through an overlay, which is really an illustrative approach as to where they could be permitted or perhaps not. So you could hypothetically include sort of core areas of the town where there might be more commercial use as an example. And then, a combination of the two. So where you have an overlay and owner occupied, or an overlay with perhaps a separation distance. And what we found is, and I'll talk to you a little bit about this in the subsequent slides, we in discussions with staff and administrators found that we needed to keep this relatively simple and straightforward and really concentrate on where they should be located in a simplistic way. As I mentioned, short-term rentals we found from day one, and this isn't unique to Fort Erie. We found this almost every municipality in Ontario. Short-term rentals and its discussion can be very polarizing. As I mentioned, we have aimed to be balanced, equitable, defensible with our recommendations while adhering to the planning principles we have to follow as part of through the Planning Act and just generally speaking, good land use planning. For those who weren't in attendance, Council did accept the recommendations, including in the short-term rental recommendations report on May 29th. And what we are here tonight is to talk about how we're implementing that, which is following those recommendations and implementing them into the official plan and zoning bylaw, which were accepted by Council. So one of the recommendations we're defining, we said 2 types of short-term rentals, one being sort of dedicated and one sort of being owner-occupied. And the intent was to sort of, as I mentioned, to prepare a study that identified where these uses should be located. And we said, because there are very different types of short-term rentals, we thought we would identify or we would recommend 2 different distinct short-term rentals under the umbrella of sort of what is a short-term rental. So what we said is a dedicated one, which again is really just where the owner is not present, and it's sort of you can rent the whole building, and then owner occupied, which would be sort of where the owner is present on a permanent basis, and then the secondary use for that property would be a short-term rental, so an accessory structure or in a unit within the primary house or the residential building. We had recommended that we permit dedicated short-term rentals in the R2B zone, and that's sort of exclusively located in Crystal Beach, and that was, as we understand, that zone was established really to recognize the historical sort of legacy of that area because of the fact that it's been there for so many years to cater to the vacationing public, It's also identified generally by a smaller lot size, a smaller lot frontages than any other part of the town. And again, the area covered by the R2B zone generally serves as a place for summer residences and seasonal housing. And again, this does align generally with what we heard through the various engagement sessions. We're recommending to permit dedicated short-term rentals in existing commercial and mixed-use zones. Again, we found that because short-term rentals have been classified elsewhere, but also through case law as a commercial use, it made sense to have them located in certain commercial zones where dwelling units are also permitted. And I can appreciate that this might not be the key location for directing short-term rentals, but it is another area to support the short-term rental industry. So these zones include commercial zones, so C1, C2, C3, C7. And then we have some of the commercial mixed use zones, which are CM, U1, U2, U4, U5, and U6. So again, just understanding where dwelling units are permitted. And this is where we're suggesting that short-term rentals would be supported again, in the commercial zones. This is just a illustrative understanding of where the existing licenses currently are located within the town. Again, this is based on the information we received in 2022, which you can see certainly a large number in Crystal Beach, which we would call sort of the yellow and blue is in orange is the R2B zone. And you can see on the right where they are also sort of dispersed, generally around the waterfront and sort of some of the smaller sort of clusters of development throughout. So just a few things to note. So zones where dedicated short-term rentals are proposed to be permitted represents generally where the majority of short-term rentals are licensed. And there's a few things that we heard throughout the process is why wouldn't you open up the whole waterfront? That's where the short-term rentals want to be located. And what we've found through our research and the best practices work is that there's actually no other municipality in Ontario where they've undertaken a study and provided specific land use regulations to guide short-term rentals. There actually isn't a municipality out there that's done that, and would be precedent setting. So one of the reasons why we didn't want to open up the entire waterfront is because we didn't feel it would be defensible, but it doesn't mean that short-term rentals couldn't be located in the waterfront without going through perhaps a rezoning or minor variance or some sort of planning approval. As I understand from staff that there is an upcoming housekeeping bylaw amendment that will permit additional dwelling units within waterfront zones, which is it's like having another apartment, which we rented out long-term. But there could be an opportunity, again, as I understand from staff, where owner-occupied short-term rentals within waterfront zones could be permitted either through an existing legal accessory or secondary unit. So I understand that there's a bit of additional work that's going to happen to understand where short-term rentals, where it might be owner-occupied, could be located along the waterfront. I should also note that licensed short-term rentals that exist on the date of the approval of the zoning bylaw amendment, so we're here at the statutory public meeting to talk about that zoning bylaw amendment, so once that is approved, should it be approved, those existing licenses will be considered legal non-conforming. So it means that while it might not be permitted on the day of the approval, they will be permitted because they received a license beforehand. And legal non-conforming short-term rentals will be permitted until that property is sold because the licenses are not transferable. The license isn't renewed, hypothetically, or the license is revoked, or the owner applies for zoning change, which would mean it would be legal then moving forward, provided they got approval. The other recommended approach that we identified was to permit owner-occupied short-term rentals throughout the town. Again, as a secondary use, so where you have the owner of the dwelling who lives on the property permanently, they could have a short-term rental on their property as sort of legally once this is approved. There would be a maximum of one short-term rental per residential property, and it may include single rooms. It doesn't necessarily have to be a separate structure on the property. We also recommended a more streamlined or expedited application process. And again, that was mainly to respond to the fact that a zoning amendment can represent potentially a significant amount of money and some time. So what we did is we listened to members of the public and stakeholders to identify that this is something that perhaps the town could consider. So where a short-term rental is requested outside of the zones identified for permission. So where it's outside of the R2B zone, And again, this is not necessarily for owner occupied. This is where you would have a dedicated short-term rental. An individual could go through a rezoning or some sort of other process to allow that short-term rental to be permitted. And again, in the future, council may identify an alternative application process that could expedite and streamline the process. But currently, right now, a minor variance or a zoning bylaw amendment may be required, provided the town assesses this a bit more and sort of identifies that as the process to follow. So just to summarize the proposed changes, again, we recommended that really it's a primary definition to describe what a short-term rental is, and then two subsequent definitions to talk about a dedicated short-term rental and an owner-occupied short-term rental, because again, they'd be permitted in different zones. Permit dedicated short-term rentals in commercial mixed-use zones. Permit dedicated short-term rentals in the R2B zone, which is exclusive to Crystal Beach. Permit owner-occupied short-term rentals throughout the town, and identify objectives and criteria for permitting short-term rentals throughout the town, in addition to those where it might not be permitted as the date of approval of the zoning bylaw amendment. So what does that process look like, and what the town might consider in the future? Now, in terms of next steps, again, the intent of this evening's meeting is to obtain comments and input on the drafts that have been presented and the drafts that have been posted. We're hoping that we can get feedback by September 25th. And then my understanding is that they would move forward to council at a subsequent meeting for consideration for approval. And with that, Your Worship, that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bender. Do members of council have any questions? Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Mr. Bender, for the presentation. Just had a couple of questions, and certainly there'll be some follow-ups with staff as well, but where did the parking requirement of one spot per bedroom come from?
Through Your Worship, it's a good question. We propose that based on sort of best practices and discussions with staff. I do know where you're coming from, and I think staff have a good response. My understanding is that there's consideration to perhaps reconsider that based on not only the feedback received, but understanding what might be actually reasonable given the local context.
And if I can continue, Your Worship, thank you. And since it is your report that is before us tonight for information as staff move forward with a recommendation report, you mentioned best practices. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on what those would be.
Certainly, and through Your Worship, so the best practices, what we did is we looked at a number of municipalities throughout Ontario and across Canada with similar amenities to Fort Erie. Again, I recognize that there is no community exactly the same as Fort Erie, but from a planning perspective, we worked with staff to identify a number of different municipalities that would have similar characteristics, and looked at sort of their zoning bylaws and official plans in terms of how they assessed short-term rentals, where they were permitted, where they weren't, and we sort of took that to sort of inform the discussion when we developed options.
Perfect, thank you, Your Worship. And those, I'm assuming a summary of that information that you reviewed would be available for council to review?
And through Your Worship, to the councillor, absolutely, it's in our report. So we have all the different municipalities that were reviewed, sort of what was found, and how that sort of informed our review. But absolutely, it's in the report.
No, but I'm speaking specifically to the parking spots per bedroom unit, or maybe you can draw my attention to that part of the report.
Oh, in terms of parking spots, I honestly, at my fingertips, I don't have that information. I can certainly get back to you, though.
Okay, that would be appreciated. And then just further to that, also the justification for limiting the number of bathrooms. Could you speak to some of the logic or how you came to that determination?
Bathrooms or bedrooms?
Bedrooms. Bathrooms might be a good question too, but we'll focus on bedrooms for now.
For now, okay. And through Your Worship, in terms of bedrooms, we follow what was in the town's licensing bylaw for the most part. There are municipalities that have short-term rentals that permit more and permit less, but it was suggested that we follow what was in the town's licensing bylaw.
Perfect. And then lastly, with some residential properties, more specifically in the R2B zone or historic Crystal Beach, there are many, or I'm aware of several units of residential units where the property is residential but has more than one accessory unit on that property, and they are suitable for rental in terms of long-term rent. But I'm just wondering why the same approach from a short-term rental use would not be supported in your report.
And through your worship, I think for the most part, once staff completes their work on the whatever, and I don't know if I'm going to get the terminology right, but whether it's be accessory residential units or accessory dwelling units, I think depending on the information contained therein, it could be something that could be discussed further. What we've heard, at least in our discussions, was having multiple short-term rentals on a property could be a particular issue. So we had suggested starting with one. But if it's something that the council and staff feel that adding more or identifying more, then I'm sure that could be considered.
Thank you. And then the last question, I know the last presentation you made was over Zoom, and I'm just wondering, was there any reason why WSB didn't join us physically for the meeting tonight?
And through your worship, we were asked to stay to attend virtually.
Thank you.
Any other members of council? Councillor Noyes.
Thank you. Through you to Mr. Benner. Mr. Benner, on page 17 and 18 of your proposal, you talk about alternatives, and I'm not quite clear on what you're recommending on page 17 and 18 of your slide show today.
If through your worship, if you permit, I can go back to that just to ensure we're seeing the same thing. So you said, Councillor, 17 and 18?
Yeah, start with 17 because I think 18 just kind of repeats it.
Okay, so 17, just to make sure we're on the same page, that's the one that says identify an expedited application process?
Yeah, that one.
So again, as I mentioned, we've heard from a number of different people that the process to amend a zoning bylaw can be costly and time consuming, especially if people want to get considered and get an approval for a rezoning to permit a short-term rental on their property. So we had identified that perhaps a solution could be is to identify a streamlined process. What, again, hypothetically, is there an opportunity through the town's existing meeting schedule, through the Committee of Adjustment, to have a subcommittee for short-term rentals, which could be a platform for people to provide input on future applications, could be an opportunity to provide comments on an existing short-term rental. That's kind of what we were identifying. But we didn't fall on a particular one recommendation because it was discussed that perhaps the town needed to take this away and understand implications, staffing resources, things of that sort.
Thank you for that. I guess my take on this is...
So this is for questions.
Yeah, my take on this is that what you're proposing is that if a property isn't zoned under the current, like whatever this council decides upon, falls outside that zoning, they then have an opportunity of going through a minor variance to get the zoning changed to allow the short-term rental?
And through your worship, that generally, yes. It depends. It could be a minor variance. It could be a rezoning. There's only so many opportunities under the Planning Act to do a change of use on a property. So that's why we identified a rezoning or a minor variance. Minor variance being likely cheaper, likely quicker. But it depends if that's the approach that staff and the town want to consider.
Has this, okay, because you used best practices in other municipalities as example, is there any other municipality that says, okay, if you're not zoned to have a short-term rental, we're going to change the whatever to allow you to rezone a special way, so to speak, so it costs you less money? Are there examples of that have occurred?
And through your worship, honestly, in our experience, no. But we also hadn't heard the amount of feedback. I mean, we certainly want to develop, local recommendations, that based on the feedback that we received. And I will say this is the first time we've heard that. And again, I don't disagree with it. We just hadn't heard it before, but that a rezoning can be costly and time consuming. So we just wanted to be responsive to the information and the input that we received, which is why we recommended this. But to answer your question directly, no, I haven't seen that before.
And I guess my question is, would this not perhaps, if this suggestion follows through, that you can just ask for rezoning of your particular property, would this just not basically open the gates for anybody who wants to zone, like it kind of makes this process that we're doing now almost mute, if anybody can then apply to a committee that's not yet established to say, okay, we want, here's our money, we want a consideration for rezoning. Like, I think it may be sending the wrong message. You have any thought on that?
And through your worship, so anyone can submit an application to rezone, or anyone can submit an application for a committee of adjustment to change the use of a property. I guess it depends on how much pressure is the town facing on change of use for short-term rental. And again, if I didn't want to necessarily leave the town sort of wondering what the options were. So if there's, again, I don't know if there's going to be significant pressure once the documents, if they are approved, once they are, if there's significant pressure, then this is an option for the town to consider. Hypothetically, if there was pressure for another use, it's certainly something that the town can consider. But I just wanted to do my best to respond to the feedback that we received.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Any other members of council? Mr. Bender, just to follow up on Councillor Noyes' questions. So you're suggesting that a change of use of a zoning could be contemplated to be done by way of minor variance? And
so it can be, yes, a change of use can be considered through minor variance, provided it meets the 4 tests. So it's, again, provided that, and you would meet all the other requirements, generally could be considered minor in nature. Again, provided that the property is well suited for it and it's evaluated by staff. Yes, there have been applications, certainly in other municipalities. I can't speak for the town, but certainly in other municipalities where a change of use was permitted through a minor variance.
And if it's a minor variance application, does the public have a right of appeal if they don't agree with the decision of the Committee of Adjustment?
Yes, they do.
On a minor variance application?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll be asking staff about that.
Okay. If I'm mistaken, I apologize, but I fairly certain there's the ability to appeal a minor variance application.
Right. And so we're currently in the middle of what everybody's calling a housing crisis. And there may be other situations throughout the history of a municipality where there may be some uses of property that might be attractive to change. Does the municipality set any path that may be of concern by identifying short-term rentals for an expedited change of use policy relative to rezoning in terms of any other housing application? In other words, a developer might come forward and say, I've got a plan to put forward this many affordable rental units. How about expediting my process? Are we getting into difficult waters here?
I mean, to be completely honest, it's a bit tricky for me to respond in terms of some of the ramifications of it, but I mean, again, it relates to how much pressure the town is facing, and is this something that the town really should be considering because of the vast number of applications it might be receiving? I'm not suggesting everybody thinks this way, but adding a short-term rental on a property could be considered relatively minor. I'm also not suggesting that an application to expedite affordable rental units isn't something that shouldn't be prioritized. So the talk about precedent setting or setting the town up, I guess it just depends on how many opportunities you think might be coming down the pipeline for the town to consider. And certainly the town can consider any of these or none, depending on the interests of the town and what's best for the town.
Thank you. Your discomfort is noted. Councillor Noyes, back to you.
Well, thank you, Mayor Redekop, through you. Just a thought in regards to what's considered a minor variance, and just in your opinion. So someone had an owner-operated short-term rental, they were licensed, and they decided that, they want $1 million, and they need to move to, they want to move to Australia. Would that be considered a minor variance when they want to continue changing it from an owner-operated to a dedicated short-term rental? Would you consider that a minor variance?
Through your worship, it's a very good question, not one I've thought about to date. Because one could argue that is perhaps significant, depending.
Okay, so
I'd have to get back to you.
perhaps you could think about that, and during the course of the next part of this process, you and staff can have some dialogue on that. Councillor Noyes, anything further? Okay. So thank you very much, Mr. Bender. We appreciate the information. We're going to go to Mr. Borma to provide a presentation relative to the staff's perspective on this. Good evening.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council and the public. Town planning staff would like to thank everyone who has submitted comments to date regarding the draft official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment, and thank everyone who is attending this evening for their interest in this project. This is the first draft of the official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment to incorporate short-term rentals. Planning staff, together with the town's consultant, will be taking back all of the comments submitted as part of this public meeting this evening and addressing these comments in further revisions to the draft documents. Planning staff have received a number of public submissions prior to this public meeting, and some of these issues staff would like to briefly discuss at this point in the meeting. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. And some of these comments have already arisen, but we'll go through them. So a number of written submissions have been submitted regarding the proposed parking requirement of 1 space per bedroom. As a short-term rental could have a potential of 3 bedrooms or 8 occupants as per the town's short-term rental licensing bylaw, there is a need for parking. However, it is acknowledged that many of these existing short-term rentals and properties within the Crystal Beach R2B zone may not be able to accommodate the number of proposed parking spaces. As such, town staff, together with the consultant, will explore alternative options and parking ratios to ensure that we are striking the right balance. Secondly, waterfront zones. In the current draft zoning bylaw amendment, waterfront zones have not been included to permit both dedicated short-term rentals and owner-occupied short-term rentals. At the May 29th council meeting, a motion was brought forward by Councillor Lewis to consider the waterfront, but was later withdrawn with the intention to have some further discussion following the drafting of the official plan and zoning bylaw amendment at this time. The main reason why waterfront has not been fully considered is that it had not been fully studied through the short-term rental land use study completed by WSP. Changes resulting from Bill 23, allowing for additional accessory dwelling units within urban zones, and an upcoming housekeeping bylaw amendment that the town is initiating would permit up to 3 units on waterfront residential zone lands. This may offer an opportunity, if council so chose, to permit owner-occupied short-term rentals within these zones. That was listed as an alternative in the report, and staff would still be willing to consider that if that is council's direction. Thirdly, legacy cottages. So legacy cottage rentals has also emerged as a concern. Legacy cottages are not clearly defined, but broadly speaking, they are cottages that have been with a particular family for a number of generations and have been rented out in the off weeks that the family does not occupy the cottage. Under the proposed policy and regulations, this would not be considered an owner-occupied short-term rental, as the owner must reside on the property full-time while the rental is occurring. It would fall under the definition of dedicated short-term rental, which would only be permitted in commercial zones and the R2B zone of Crystal Beach. Comments have been received to propose a third definition that would better accommodate legacy cottages. If that is the direction from council, staff would need to do some further research to explore how many cottages would be impacted by this and any other land use implications. Town staff have received a number of comments regarding the existing limit of 250 short-term rental licenses under the town's licensing bylaw. The WSP report and the scope of work that was completed by WSP was limited to providing land use opinion and not necessarily commentary on the short-term rental licensing bylaw, cap of licenses, or enforcement. However, council may direct planning and economic development and tourism staff to provide alternative licensing limits to be placed following the official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment approvals. Currently, only the licensing bylaw contains a cap for short-term licenses. So the draft documents refer to license caps, but they don't actually put in place any license caps. Streamlined approval process. So the short-term rental land use study recommended a streamlined approval process for short-term rentals that do not meet certain proposed zoning regulations. More considerations need to be given to a streamlined approval process, including mechanisms such as a minor variance that may be an opportunity through the approval process. This process would provide some degree of limited public participation. We do believe that there are limited appeal rights for minor variances for specified persons, which generally does not include members of the public. The last subject that I just wish to address, and this is by no means the entirety of the list of concerns and comments that we've received, but this is just a snapshot. But the last subject that I wish to address is owner-occupied short-term rentals as a commercial use. In the current draft, both dedicated and owner-occupied short-term rentals are being regulated as a commercial use. However, owner-occupied short-term rentals, being seen as a more compatible use and having less impact on housing availability, have been proposed to be permitted in a much broader range of zones than dedicated short-term rentals. As mentioned, this is the first draft of an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment prepared by WSP Group in consultation with town staff. And this is a very complex and divisive land use topic. Further review of all the comments received this evening and potential revisions to the draft policy and regulations need to be taken back for further consideration. A second draft of the official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment following tonight's public meeting would be made available on the Let's Talk webpage when completed. Planning staff, together with the consultant, want to present a fair and equitable set of land use policies and regulations that balance the community's interest, as well as address as many comments as possible and will be defendable if it is appealed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boerma. And I think this is the first report that you've provided to council where you've attended and presented.
Correct, this is.
Well,
Thank you.
you've done an excellent job, but I
Thank
know
you.
that you've got a lot of experience, so it appears. Any members of council? Councillor Noyes.
Well, thank you, Mayor, and I'm sorry I forgot you. I didn't catch your name.
Oh, Gary Boerma.
Okay, I'm sorry, your last name?
Boerma. Boerma.
Noyes, it's Boerma. You should know a Dutch name when you see
I'm
one.
just thinking it's Dutch, and here Okay. My children wore name tags, so that's how bad I am with names. So anyway. Yes, from one Dutch person to another. I think we're called, anyway, Hollanders, but anyway, that's beside the point. In regards to the streamline suggestion or comment that was there, I'm wondering why, since there is an opportunity for them, for anyone, if they require a zoning change for their property, why would we, since we've gone through this for 5 years, why would we then say, okay, we can be considered a minor variance and this committee over here can make the decision?
Through your worship to the councillor, as I mentioned, it's something that needs to be explored further. In the WSP report, it was a recommended approach to present a streamlined approach to dealing with these. I think as a result of partially the public feedback that was received, and as well as that map was still up that showed where the current licenses are located, and the R2B zone where most of the dedicated short-term rentals would be permitted under this scheme. There's quite a number of short-term rentals that are outside of that area, so I think that's kind of where this process of having a streamlined process would come from. Allowing for new uses through a minor variance is, I believe, a newer concept that has had some OLT appeal background to it and some cases that have gone through that. And as Mr. Bender kind of alluded to, if it meets the 4 tests of a minor variance, there is a possibility there. But staff would really wish to take this all back and present a more formal approach with how do we deal with short-term rentals that would not be permitted under the proposed land use policies and regulations, and really take that time and outline each of the processes, whether it be a zoning bylaw amendment, a minor variance, or any other process. To staff's knowledge, a zoning amendment and a minor variance are the only 2 tools currently within the Planning Act to permit a use that's not permitted in a certain zone. So we do think we are working with those two application processes, but we wish to take that back and present a more fulsome discussion on that in a future report.
Thank you for that explanation. I would imagine when you come back with that recommendation or more descriptive, there will be strict criteria of what would make it feasible and what wouldn't make it feasible, and what the committee that was suggested consists of.
Through your worship to the councillor, very much so. We even, through the creation of the official plan amendment, tried to place some criteria together where we could consider short-term rentals under a policy framework that may not be in an area where they're zoned to be permitted. So there are some criteria in the draft official plan amendment that would kind of guide any body's decision-making when it comes to permitting short-term rentals in a zone where they wouldn't be permitted with the proposed draft zoning amendment.
But in regards to this 5-year that we've been working on this, the whole goal was to basically create zoning areas that they're allowed and zoning areas where they're not allowed. And this kind of sounds like, okay, if you're not allowed, I know you can always apply through the other zoning thing, zoning way, but, because anyone can. But it sounds like you're kind of saying, yeah, these are our rules, this is our zoning, but, you know, you can go over here and it's fairly easy and we'll probably approve you. I'm just making a comment. What do you think?
Count yourself. Good.
Through your worship to the councillor, the way it was described to me was, for instance, on a dedicated short-term rental, which would be limited to commercial zones and the R2B zone of Crystal Beach. The R2B zone doesn't encompass the entirety of Crystal Beach. In certain areas, that zone boundary falls on the center line of a street. So if I was a resident on one side of the street, I could potentially be permitted in the R2B zone to have a dedicated short-term rental, but on the other side of the street, it might not be permitted. So I think in those instances, there might be opportunities for, even though it's not permitted in the zoning, for staff and council or the Committee of Adjustment, whatever body it might be, to evaluate whether that's still appropriate in instances like that.
Just one further comment, Mr. Birdman. And the example I gave to Mr. Benner was that someone has a owner-occupied short-term rental and wins $1 million, decides he's going to move to Australia. I was going to say Hawaii, but they may not want to go there right now. Would that be considered, and then wants to basically change that owner-occupied into a dedicated short-term rental, would that be considered a minor variance or meet the criteria for the zoning change or exception?
Through your worship to the councillor, I don't know if I have that answer for you right now. It's something that we can take back and consider. It would be probably dependent on so many different factors, planning And planners typically in their evaluation look at the surrounding neighborhood. One of the four tests of a variance is it compatible, or is the development appropriate for that area? So it would be dependent on quite a number of factors. Would that possibility exist? Potentially, but staff would like to take that back and present all the options for approval process under whatever proposed zoning amendment is proposed for short-term rentals.
Thank you, nothing else.
Thank you very much, Councillor Noyes. Anyone else? Mr. Borman, just, has Bill 23 complicated the situation in terms of how you would change the zoning? Because if you used a minor variance, I think Bill 23 limited some of the appeal rights of residents, did it not?
Correct. Bill 23 has significantly limited appeal rights in certain applications. My understanding is minor variance and consent to specified persons, as well as on the other side of the equation, there have been significant changes to the number of accessory apartments that are now permitted as of right on lots that staff need to consider regarding the town as a whole. So there's a lot of fronts that provincial policy is making changes to this short-term rental planning process that were not necessarily contemplated at the beginning of the process.
My understanding is that staff's position has been, and I think it was referred to this evening, that the properties that have an existing short-term rental license, regardless of where they're located, in particular if they're located outside the areas that have been identified for short-term rental use, will constitute, once a zoning amendment is made, will constitute an existing non-conforming use. Is that?
Correct. I believe there was a previous report that is referenced in the PDS 59, which is before you this evening, that referenced a legal decision that a former solicitor for the town had put together, which spoke to the legal nonconformance of short-term rentals that are currently licensed.
And if that's true, an existing non-conforming use isn't lost until the use is discontinued, isn't that correct?
I believe that's most likely the case law behind it. I know Mr. Bender had some comments on the selling of a property and that going away with the ownership, so I think more research would need to be done in that area to determine if that's how that would actually unfold in a legal manner.
So my understanding is that may be something that could be regulated by license. So if you change ownership, maybe that's a licensing issue, but typically an existing non-conforming use, once established, continues until the use is discontinued, and that could be regardless of who the owner might be from time to time. But my question is, if it's an existing non-conforming use, there's no need for a zoning change, is there?
Correct. Those who would be considered a legal non-conforming would be legal non-conforming under whatever circumstances they are operating. So if they are, for instance, if there was a 3 parking space requirement and they only had 1, they would be legal non-conforming under 1 parking space. Then any new regulations would not apply to them outside of the licensing bylaw.
Right. So there were 2 specific items that I wanted to also ask you about. The one had to do with owner-occupied properties being considered as a residential use as opposed to commercial use. And that would mean it would be something tantamount to a home occupation.
That is something we can take back and consider. As I mentioned, under the current framework that was developed by WSP, all short-term rentals were considered as commercial uses, but in other areas, to my understanding, in some cases, short-term rentals have been considered as home occupations. So I think in terms of an owner-occupied short-term rental, that's something staff can review again to determine if that's more appropriate as a home occupation or as a full commercial use.
Just to be clear, the other areas that you've referred to or mentioned that have regarded this as a home occupation, it's owner-occupied. It has to be an owner-occupied. It can't be dedicated as you've defined it. Okay. And then finally, where you started, which was the parking space. So if that is modified after consideration by staff or a recommendation is made to modify that, where what will the plan be for where individuals can park? Because if there are 3 bedrooms, maybe all the occupants come in a minivan, or maybe there's 2 separate vehicles, 4 people in one, 4 people in another, if it's 8 people, but still there's 2 vehicles. What would the plan be for where these people will park?
So staff, in our initial discussions, we were discussing availability of municipal parking or on-street parking. That brings up the question of parking enforcement, parking permitting. There's many options. As I mentioned, the area that has limited off-street private parking, where the R2B zone of Crystal Beach, also has limited on-street parking. So there are a lot of things that we need to consider, but staff would be willing to look at the bylaw to see if there's some way that location to available parking or on-street parking, things of that nature can be worked into the bylaw to alleviate some of the need for private off-street parking. However, we don't want to cause any further municipal parking issues throughout Crystal Beach, because as we're aware, in certain areas, there are already parking issues.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Borma. Anyone else? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we're going to go to the public now. If there's anyone who wishes to address council, please come forward and state your name. Yes, please come forward. State your name and address for the record, please.
Sure. My name is Laura Kozlowski, and my address is in Niagara-on-the-Lake, but I have the Waterworks building in Crystal Beach, so 4100 Erie.
So could you also give us your Niagara-on-the-Lake address?
Sure, it's 499 Carlton Street.
And your
was-
address here?
My address is,
Property here is at,
well, I have 4100 Erie, and then I also have 269 Derby.
okay, thank you.
I know every municipality is different, but I did run a bed and breakfast actually in Niagara-on-the-Lake in the 90s, and a lot of the discussion you're having here, we had there. And so if I can just say just a few things to point out, Bill 23 is for residentially zoned properties only. So that helps you with your issue. You cannot have 2 or 3 dwellings on an agricultural zone property unless it's a help house or unless it's agritourism, and it's not a variance, it's site-specific zoning for that property with that person. And the reason that we did site-specific zoning in Niagara-on-the-Lake is because we set our criteria very clearly. 1 bedroom, 1 parking. You don't have the parking, you pay the town $200, and you have to ask for site-specific zoning, and the town has to approve it. And the reason is not because we're greedy, it's because we're keeping in mind the pleasure of everyone in the area, the neighbors, the owner of the property, and the guests that are coming there. We don't want upset guests that have to walk 3 blocks with their luggage. We don't want upset neighbors whose guests are always parking in front of their driveway, and we don't want upset short-term rental owners who aren't maybe getting the bookings, they've paid $750, and then they realize, oh, people aren't coming here, because once they figure out we don't have parking. So to alleviate all that, as a municipality, it's good to be really clear. And so we have to decide as a municipality, what do we want this to look like? So 1 parking spot per bedroom really works well in Niagara-on-the-Lake, because we do have street parking issues, all kinds of problems, right? And one way to get around it is, if you want you're calling it a minor variance, we call it site-specific zoning. You want site-specific zoning, part of the criteria is you don't have the parking, you gotta pay us $200 for every parking spot that you don't have, and then tell us how you're gonna accommodate your guests. So that's one thing. And the Bill 23, don't worry about it, it's only for residential. So it's not for commercially zoned areas, R2B, none of that. It's only residential. And the purpose of Bill 23 is to help with the housing crisis. It's not to add more B&Bs. So if someone said to you, oh, I'm building this thing because I'm going to do Airbnb, no, you can't do that. Like, that's not the purpose of Bill 23. So that's a couple things. The other thing is the 250 criteria, the number that we're talking about. What do we do if we have a non-conforming 100 of your licenses are non-conforming? Does that mean you're not going to open up that 250 number? Because here I have, CMU2 zoned, and I want to have eventually my 4 short-term, my 4 2-bedrooms, I've got the parking, I'm commercial, I'm across from the beach, I should be allowed to get that, but I can't right now because a whole bunch of non-conforming have these licenses. So I just wanted to be clear about that, how that's going to work or pan out. The other thing is, sorry, I have a bunch of notes here. Okay, housing crisis, walkable communities. So I think if you think, you know, we're just going to have the commercial area and up Derby because that's a historic street and the R2B zoning, we stick with that. Anything non-conforming, what we do in Niagara Lake, if a person leaves, they don't carry the license with them. It's just they have the license while they're there, they're non-conforming. If the town and the person who owns the building can't come to some agreement that's site-specific to their non-conforming property now, then you can have it as long as you're there, and once you're gone, that's gone. And you can't just hold the 250 number then because that person's holding one spot because they're non-conforming. So once they're gone, they're gone. Or you could say you need to have the parking, whatever. Now, one of the reasons why in Niagara Lake we had site-specific more than 3 bedrooms. We don't care if it's 2 or 3 bedrooms in Niagara Lake. It's the same thing. But once you go over 3, you have to apply for site-specific because the septic system may not be large enough to accommodate the extra bedrooms. Or you may have a pool, in which case, oh my gosh, we have to look at all your pool regulations. And now in Niagara Lake, if you have a pool, you can't have a short-term rental unless you have a lifeguard. And you have to check the chemicals in that pool every hour because someone can get Legionnaire's disease like they did at the Pillar and Post, or they can get, you know what I mean? So when we're talking about short-term rental, we don't care who you are, where you are, how much you make, whatever, as long as you meet the criteria. And the purpose for that is so that there's no bias, everyone is clear from day one, and if you don't meet the criteria, you and the town have a personal relationship. You talk about how you're going to accommodate that. Maybe you're going to get rid of the grass on your front lawn and put in 2 parking spots, and that happens all over Niagara Lake. But what we don't want to see are people lining the streets, especially in Crystal Beach. It's Chautauqua, right? It's really narrow streets, and that's an issue. So that's something that we always keep in mind in Niagara Lake is how are the neighbors, the guests, and the locals all going to get along with this? And so that's how we had set the criteria. And we have a ton of short-term rentals, B&Bs, you name it in Niagara. But we had to go through this terrible learning curve for years and years and years to get to this point. And I'm saying I was dealing with it in the 90s, so it's a long time coming. The other thing is, short-term rental. I think that's about it. We don't have zoning changes because it opens up a whole can of worms. We had an issue in Niagara Lake where we had a corner agricultural lot. We turned it into commercial. It was supposed to be for a candle making company. The owner passed away. He sold the commercial property to McDonald's. Bing, bang, bong, you got a McDonald's next to an Airbnb right in the middle of an agricultural community. So zoning is a big issue. And you don't want to change zoning because I can't even imagine all these beautiful historic cottages along Lake Erie turning into Miami Beach. And it's to get into those cottages, you need 1.5 million, 2 million, 3 million. If we don't do a site-specific zoning for those individuals that want to do it, and we say you got to change the zoning, and then they decide, okay, I'm going to change the zoning, I'm going to get a hotel, I'm going to build a hotel there. I don't think that that's really what Crystal Beach wants. I don't think we want Miami Beach on the waterfront. So I think there's a way to really look at this and say, what criteria do we think is safe and healthy and normal? And also, we don't want to penalize the people that already have the licenses, but if they're not within that B2B area or the commercial area, how can we work with those people to get the ideal criteria that we want, which is 1 parking per bedroom, make sure they've got, sewers, city water, natural gas, make sure that, they've got the space that accommodates that kind of thing. And so maybe looking at the hardships that we've gone through in Niagara Lake and kind of using that as a springboard to kind of help facilitate this. But I don't know, that's just my 2 cents. Like, those are some of the things, some of the issues, and I can submit something for the 25th, before the 25th of some of the issues that we've had to deal with. because all of that came up today in this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before you go, any members of council have any questions? Thank you very much, Ms. Kozlowski.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to address council? Yes, please come forward, Ms. Marshall. Good evening.
Good evening. Hi, I'm Amanda Marshall, 3504 East Main Street. I've already sent a letter in, so I'm not just going to go over that again, but mainly the parking. So it's just the parking is the main component in the letter that I sent. I guess it's more also around the properties that are currently licensed. So if you put it in the bylaw and somebody went to go get a license in the short-term rental bylaw, how would that impact the people who already have a license? So that's just a question I'm asking in that regard.
I'm sorry, I don't think I follow that.
Okay, so if somebody's licensed right now, and if you actually put the parking per bedroom into the short-term rental bylaw, and somebody went to go and renew their license, that would impact their ability to renew their license because they're not going to meet the criteria at that point. So now we're going to take all those properties in R2B that are already have an existing license and now put them through another microscope to find out if they have parking, and so that would mean that potentially they might not get a renewal of their license. So I just want to make sure that that's not going to impact the people who are already licensed if that parking component gets put into place the way it's been written out. The other thing that I wanted to address is Mr. Bender's slide 10 in his deck. In terms of the principal residence definition, the entire time we've been going through this process, they talked about owner-occupied, first of all, being everywhere throughout the town, and secondly, there wasn't any provisions in regards to whether the owner should be on site or not during that time period. Now, in this definition, it's been updated, and it says that the owner has to be on site at the same time as the rental. So again, in terms of, there's a couple of components here about the parking. How does that work if there's 3 bedrooms and the owner's supposed to be there and they're renting out spaces? What happens with that owner-occupied property? The other thing is that how are you going to monitor that the person is actually there, the owner is actually there? I'm going to give you an example. So what if a property has is outside of the zone? It's almost like Ms. Noyes' question, and the property owner moves out for 2 months. So it is their principal residence, but they move out every summer and they rent out their property. It is their it is their principal residence, but where would they fall? Would they fall under a dedicated STR because they're not? Or would they fall under the owner-occupied, but they're not because of that slight change to this definition since we had these open forums and discussions? They've put in this small clause that says that the owner must be on site. Okay, so this has been changing as we go. So the whole time we've had these public consultations, the owner-occupied component was such that the owner wasn't going to be there. It was their principal residence. Now that's changed by the slight change in that definition. So I just want to point that out. In terms of the legal non-conforming, what we've been told from the get-go was that legal non-conforming could mean that the person could sell that property. If it's been licensed, they could sell that property, and that they could always apply for a license if there were enough to be had. In this new presentation, we're saying that the minute somebody sells the property, that even if it's not in a permitted zone, that the new owner would never be able to get a license. And I thought, and that was never described to us. We were never, as part of the open forum and part of all this discussions, that was never indicated, and that we never had a chance to discuss that, because we were always told if something is legal non-conforming, it could be a short-term rental no matter who owns the property, because it's property specific. So I just want to be able to bring that forward. And then in terms of the dedicated STRs, where right now there's 2 properties that are licensed on the property, My concern, again, is what happens with those properties if they're currently licensed and they're dedicated STRs. What's going to happen then if all of a sudden it gets zoned where you can only, or this zoning says that you can only have one? What's going to happen with that? So those are just my concerns on top of the letter that I already sent in. So I'm not just going to say ditto, like everything I've said for probably 5 years as well, Emery. The same sort of thing has come to pass, and I know everybody's tired with everything, and we want to get it right. And we want to be able to work properly with the town to be able to know what to expect and how we're going to move forward. So I just wanted to bring some of my concerns forward with some of these changes that have been added since we've had the previous discussion in May.
Thank you. Any members of council have any questions? Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall, for your presentation. And in regards to property specific for the short-term rental, through this 5-year process, that question has been asked and answered. And I think it was actually that I don't know if you recall, that it was the property that had the short-term rental. That's how I understood it. I think I actually...
That if it was a short-term rental, it would be legal non-conforming, and it continued to be a short-term rental as long as there were enough licenses to be had. And that's what we've been told all the way through. But this is not what's been said tonight. So, yeah.
Again, that was my understanding
Right.
of it. And I also understood, and I could be wrong, the way I understood, I don't know if this is how you understand, I have to make it a question, so I kind of talk around it.
Okay.
Is that in the non-conforming use in regards to parking, if you currently have a short-term rental and you don't have the required number of parking spaces, you would be grandfathered in. That's
As long as you don't put it in the short-term rental bylaw. If you add it to the short-term rental bylaw to marry all of them together, that would then impact the ones that are currently licensed.
okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? So is it your understanding, Ms. Marshall, that there's currently some distinction between owner-occupied and dedicated?
There is a distinction in the definition that has been presented, yes.
Well, you've spoken about that, but you're talking as if something is going to change that doesn't currently exist. And there is no owner-occupied criterion right now.
It says principal residence.
You don't have
But in terms of the
to
criteria-
occupy, my understanding is, you correct me if I'm wrong, you can get a short-term license whether you are the principal occupant of the property or not in Fort Erie.
Yes.
Okay. So I think you're conflating the desire to establish a definition and create two types of short-term rental licenses, one for owner-occupied,
Right.
one for dedicated commercial use.
Right, so there's two.
I think you're confusing those with the current system.
No, not really, because the definition for the one that you want to implement owner-occupied says it's somebody's principal residence.
Well,
Okay? But then the other caveat to that is they must be on site during the rental period. So it's a bit of a catch-22, right? So if somebody is not there, is that considered then they have to apply for a dedicated short-term rental license?
so what you're doing is you're creating the aura of changes being made where there hasn't been something. We're moving to creating something, and that creation is going to require certain things, definitions, certain licensing requirements. So anyways, this is an opportunity for questions. I don't think we should be entering into a debate.
Oh, that's okay.
The other item that you made reference to was the legal non-conforming use, and I hope you appreciate that there's a distinction between the legal definition of a non-conforming use for zoning purposes and the regulation of a property through licensing. You understand that there's a distinction?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay?
Councillor Dubanow.
Yes, Your Worship, and through you to Ms. Marshall. Thank you very much. I think, just to get some clarification, because I think I know where you were going with the owner-occupied side of things, and I agree with where the mayor was coming to. I think you're both right, but maybe you can clarify this for me. Are you talking about different revisions of the consultant's report, where the definition of owner-occupied has changed
Correct.
through the revisions
That's
that are being
correct.
presented by the consultant?
That's correct.
Okay, that's where I thought you were going. I just wanted to
So the whole
clarify.
time they've said that it's a principal residence, so the owner-occupied definition would be somebody's principal residence. So whatever that definition is for a principal residence, could be 6 months or 5 months, whatever the definition is going to be, because that's not written out yet about what a principal residence is. But now what they've added in there, though, is an owner-occupied, the definition for an owner-occupied means that it has to be their principal residence, and if they're renting it out, they must be on site at all times.
And if I may, Your Worship, that, and it's your understanding that was not included in previous reports that the consultant had provided on this specific issue?
That's correct.
And just to follow up on that, Your Worship, just to acknowledge, the mayor, when he mentions we have not made a decision yet, you acknowledge that we don't have a framework and none of this exists yet,
Yes, that's
right?
correct.
Okay, thank
Yes.
you very much.
Okay,
Thank you. Any other members of council?
okay.
Thank you very much, Ms.
Okay,
Marshall.
thanks.
Is there anyone else who wishes to address council? Yes, please come forward, sir. Good evening.
Evening. Evening, Your Worship, esteemed council. My name is Doug Swift. I'm 1711 McDonald Drive. On behalf of the over 500 members of the Fort Erie Community Preservation Coalition, the over 1,080 signatories of our petitions supporting our goals, and our hundreds of financial supporters, I'm grateful for the opportunity to address council tonight. We appreciate the hard work and determined effort council has made over the past several years to fully examine the short-term rental impacts on our community. This has been an often challenging process as the issue can be contentious, emotional, and divisive. At this point in the process, you've openly and professionally processed all the arguments, conducted the research, and have come to your conclusions. We have chosen tonight to not call in a large show of force from our supporters. It is felt that you have already heard plenty of the concerns and complaints from both sides of the issue, and do not need to hear the same arguments repeated yet again. Generally speaking, we are encouraged and supportive of the direction the draft bylaw amendments are going. Now that the process is being prepared to be voted on, there are a couple of details that we'd like to comment on, much of which has been discussed tonight. The need to make a zoning bylaw amendment easier for an STR than any other zoning request for other uses. Some of the suggested criteria for rezoning in the bylaws and in the report are very vague and broad. For example, in the draft bylaws, section 4, paragraph 8, subsection B, in quoting there's a compelling reason to permit an STR use, such as it can be demonstrated that a dwelling has a history of use as a vacation cottage rental or is part of a unique business opportunity. How would this history be determined? It is extremely subjective and vague and hard to define and hard to document. And then the unique business opportunity comment really flies in the face of the town's definition that an STR is a commercial business and has no place in residential neighborhoods. We agree with the staff's recommendations that a streamlined process would not be necessary. Zoning, for its intended purpose, is there to protect property owners' rights and expectations of what their neighborhood is and will become. Otherwise, there's no way of knowing what the future might bring with a zoning change. We strongly disagree with the staff's opinion that existing licensed STRs in zones where they are not permitted would be legal nonconforming. We've been advised by several of our legal counselors that this would not be the case, despite previous reports. There have been no adopted definition in the town's official plan of what an STR is. and as such, licenses have been issued during an interim basis under the town's provisional pilot program, which we are still in. These STRs were never considered to be legal. We would be happy to arrange a meeting with our councillors and your staff informally to point out why the legal nonconforming conditions would not be met. On page 11 of the report, the comments on the potential to allow STR licenses in waterfront residential zones. Any action to include the waterfront would run contrary to your planning study by WSP and the wishes of the Fort Erie residents. We do, however, see an acceptable option that would be similar to any other residential neighborhood with the owner-occupied concept being applied within the waterfront zone. If the full-time waterfront operations would cater to the non-resident dedicated STR owners. And this also flies in the face of the town's definition that an STR is a commercial business with no place in residential neighborhoods. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Swift. Do any members of council have any questions? Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Mayor. Through to Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, thank you for your presentation. I'm just a clarification. In regards to owner-occupied, wherever they may be, what is your position on that?
Well, we think that the idea of the owner-occupied in any residential zone, as it's defined as far as I understand it, where the owner is present on site and the renting out a auxiliary rental unit or some part of their house while they're in there, would be acceptable in any residential neighborhood.
Okay, thank you.
Any other member of council? Thank you very much, Mr. Swift.
Thank you.
Are there any other members of the public that wish to address council this evening? Mr. Patton, is there anyone in the digital waiting room that wishes to address council? If so, could they please raise their hand?
There's one person other than Greg from 4.
And has that person raised his or her hand?
We're just waiting to see.
We're waiting, okay. We're anticipating.
There's been no hand action.
Okay. Mr. Clerk. Heavy on the Mr. You said Mr. Mr. Clerk. I can learn, but I'm a slow learner. Mr. Clerk, have we received any late communications from the members of the public relative to this issue that you wish to make reference to?
Yes, Your Worship. Staff received written comments from the following individuals, all speaking in opposition. Anne-Marie McGonigal and Norm Rumfeld, 327 Cambridge Road West. David McPherson, 3856 Ryan Avenue. Terry O'Neill, the address was not provided, but the business was Perfect Stays Niagara. And finally, Michael and Melanie Bedoui, 244 Beechwood Avenue and 26 Beach Walk Crescent. These comments have been forwarded to planning staff to be considered and included in the future staff report.
So they will become part of the public record.
Correct.
Thank you very much. So then at this point, I'm going to declare this public meeting closed. And we're going to move to report PDS 59-2023. Do I have a mover? Councillor Dubanow. That report is on the floor for questions or comments. Councillor Dubanow.
Yeah, thank you very much, Your Worship. I guess I'll break the ice on this and start first. I want to thank everyone who's been involved in this process. This is now, I think, our third term that this has gone into. It's been a long process. Obviously, we want to get it right. That's why we're doing this, why we're having the consultation and working to do this. But I do have some points that I want to raise. And just first off, on the get-go, with this being Fort Erie is a very unique community. I'm certain Niagara-on-the-Lake may have ways that they do things, much of which I personally disagree with. I want to see a made-in-Fort Erie solution. I don't want to go repeating the mistakes, at least in my opinion, that have been made elsewhere as we embark upon this process. There are a few points, though, that I wanted to raise with this being an information report. I just wanted to get it on record. Much of this had been mentioned by staff earlier, but I'm just going to mention it again. With regard to the parking spaces, that one, I really don't know how that even came up. It's a very, it's a challenge for me when I look at the pressures we're facing right now with parking and the limitations we have. It's not based on bedrooms. We base it on dwellings. So, any resident who we build a house for, the province is essentially saying one parking space. It's very difficult for me to reconcile how we can deal with that for a short-term rental when we can't do it with a long-term rental, an owner-occupied residence, or other things of that nature. And personally, I don't think it makes much sense within the context of Fort Erie. The challenges we hear and the things that were raised, it's not something I have heard about, and it just strikes me as very odd how that went in there when we've never heard anything like this before. So I'm of the opinion that is a non-starter. We really need to deal with that much better than a sledgehammer like that. There's a lot of mention about owner-occupied units. That's something that I'm strongly in favor for, simply because it allows residents who are in our community who may have challenges with regard to paying the mortgage, paying their expenses, to find a way to have supplemental income. And it also prevents, it also allows for home sharing. So accommodations, instead of a separate building, so you have one person living in one building permanently and another renting, you're combining them together, which opens up hopefully another house on the market that someone can rent or buy. It's that home sharing aspect. We had a professor from McGill University who was here during our initial round who mentioned that in his research that is actually very beneficial and positive for the housing matrix of a community, whereas when we go into the dedicated short-term rentals, it's a lot cloudier and may even in fact be detrimental. So I think we should be encouraging owner-occupied. I would personally like to see the regulatory framework tweaked. I like the idea of considering it a home occupation. There are plenty of home occupations that exist in this community. The owner does not need to be on site all the time when the occupation is underway. It just needs to be their primary residence. So if a resident has a driver's license that says that is their residence, if they have a unit there that they can rent, I am totally fine with that, even if they go on holiday for a week, because it's very unlikely that an owner of a home is going to rent out their own home only to come back and have it trashed. There is a level of self-regulation to that when we're talking about individuals living on the same property in the same home as what they're renting out. So I hope that that's something we can look at and kind of massage that to better address those two distinctions. Just going through my notes here, and I appreciate the latitude, Your Worship. So with regard to the planning process, I'm not going to go on and say I have a preference for how it should be, but I do think it is necessary to have that process in place. This is something that has existed in Fort Erie for a long time. There's always been the cottages along the lake, 716 phone number, rented out when they aren't in use. And just to have that flexibility to not, if we find ourselves in an accommodation crunch where we cannot house the number of people to facilitate our business and our tourism desires, it just makes more sense to me to have a way to streamline that, have a set of regulations, things we look for, and then go from there. I think that's necessary to clarify when we move forward. I'm going to say right now that I am not sold on the idea of them being on the waterfront by right. But I have a lot of concerns about the legacy historical cottagers that have existed in Fort Erie for over 100 years, and the pressures they're facing right now to maintain those properties. Property tax is always a concern. We now have the federal government that's levying occupancy taxes. Our American friends are legally prohibited from even buying property in Canada right now, which in my opinion is xenophobic when these are our neighbors right next door, and there's a lot of movement back and forth. I think we need to find a way to either define them as home occupation, have them either, a way to have another method to define them as legacy cottages, or to have that expedited planning process where they can justify how they utilize it, maybe one weekend a month during the summer when they aren't there, to help offset those property taxes. My concern, as these pressures keep moving forward on the costs and the regulatory burdens, is that they sell them. These properties are now no longer in the hands of family members and no longer being passed down who have contributed to the cottage atmosphere of our community. They get bought up by investors who start parceling property together, and then you end up with applications that aren't consistent with what the community and council wants to see on the waterfront. I don't think there's many of us here who have an issue with, well, maybe they do. I shouldn't speak for everyone. I don't have an issue with a cottage owner who is renting out when they aren't there in a limited amount of time to help offset those costs, as long as it is not a continual commercial operation where they are not there. That's ultimately what it comes down to. If they are involved in the property, if they stay in the property, and they know the community, they know their neighbors, similar to owner-occupied or a home occupation definition, it's very unlikely someone in those situations is going to allow their property to tick off the neighbors. So my thoughts on that are there. And if we can't address those, then it makes it harder for me to say no to the waterfront by right. That's always going to be the crunch point here, is how we address the waterfront. And if we can find a way to massage this, use an expedited planning process, look at the definitions of what owner-occupied or legacy cottagers consist as, I think we can help rectify some of those concerns. But those are my thoughts. I'm going to be supporting this. It's an information report. I appreciate the work of staff and all of the public for their participation. But as I said, I laid down my thoughts on this. I'm sure there's different opinions. I appreciate and respect those opinions, and thank you very much for the time and the latitude, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Dubanow. Anyone else? Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. I'm also struggling a little bit with the parking. However, I also remember the last council meeting, there was a fourplex, and we were very concerned that there wasn't 4 parking spaces, and that we wanted to insist that there were 4 parking spaces, and the developer did come up with 4 parking spaces. But I can also see the point that it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to each bedroom. So I would like to see some leniency there, that maybe not for every, maybe two parking spaces if there's, more than 3 bedrooms or something like that. You're only allowed 8 people, so I would be flexible on that. In regards to the owner-occupied, I understand what Councillor Dubanow is saying, but I would wonder how difficult that would be to control if it was, well, yeah, you can go away some of the time, but not all of the time. I think that would be really difficult to do. However, if there's a mechanism there that, again, people could be working during the day. And I don't think they actually have to be present 24/7. I think they have to be there on a daily basis, and they have to live there. They can't be living someplace else and calling that an owner-occupied. However, if they do need to go for a holiday or something comes up and, one of them lands up in the hospital, God forbid, and they have to go away, I would think there has to be some mechanism there to allow them to take a few days off, to go here or to go there for whatever reason. But there should be some mechanism in regards to who the contact person is. They should let somebody know, by law know, to say, okay, I live I live here on Maple Street. I have a owner occupied. My mother is really sick. I got to go to Toronto for 2 weeks. This is how I can be reached. So I think there has to be some understanding there that, we can't predict everything. I do not at all favor the rezoning, expedited rezoning thing. I think the whole process that we're doing is to say, okay, this is where we want them, and this is where they should be. And if we start saying, however, if you're not here, you can go this route, it's expedited, it's not going to cost you too much money, and this committee, if they agree with you, that's fine. So I'm not for that. They always have the option of asking for rezoning, anybody does, in regards to their property, and go through the proper channels and the expenses associated. We do have a process in place to allow that to do that, and I think they should do it. I'm not clear on legacy. I can understand, and I would probably kind of lean towards that as long as it could be well established. Like a third grandson of my uncle who lived there 20 years ago, to me is not a legacy. I think there has to be some really strict guidelines on that, because that definition really has to be tied in. But I would feel the same as Councillor Dubanow does, that with prices going up and taxes going up, et cetera, if they need to rent the property out, I would say there has to be a minimum number or a maximum number that they can do it, not like 356 days a year, but I would have some leniency towards a well-defined legacy definition and also a limited number of rental days that they would be allowed to rent it to offset some of the costs. My one concern is Bill 23, which we're all trying to get used to, particularly on waterfront residential. I know one of the speakers here did talk about Bill 23 being limited to residential. You could, as by right, you could build 3, but some of our waterfront lots are residential, and they're quite big, and they could very easily meet the building code requirements in regards to setbacks, et cetera, and still have three buildings, 3 separate buildings there. So I do agree with in the report where it says, you can only have 1 additional unit. So that's kind of my feeling on it, but I do agree with the commercial areas. I do agree with the historical area, and I do agree with owner occupied. And I'm thinking that we heard it from someone here, I think off of McDonald Drive, who also kind of said, listen, I represent like 500 people or 1,000 people, and we're okay with that as long as it's owner occupied. But I do think you need to nail down that definition, and you have to be owner occupied, exceptions like I gave examples before. But you can't just, you can have 2, we can't give them any way to get around that and say, yeah, but I'm owner occupied, I don't have any other place to go, but when I do go, I'm traveling for the rest of the year. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Noyes. Anyone else? Just have a couple of questions, and one was raised by Mr. Swift, and that is in the draft zoning bylaw where there's a proposal for what would be required in order to make and succeed in an application for a rezoning to short-term rental use. If this were adopted, this doesn't necessarily indicate what the zoning application would be. Is that correct, Mr. Boerma?
Are you referring to the official plan amendment 422?
Right.
8B?
Correct.
Okay, so there is a compelling reason to permit an STR use such as it can be demonstrated that the dwelling has a history of use as a vacation cottage rental or it is part of a unique business opportunity. I believe this is some of the criteria that was put in place in the official plan amendment to guide applications that may not be permitted through the zoning. So it would be part of the criteria, but by no means all of the criteria. A, B, and C all speak to additional criteria, so minimal to no disruption of neighboring properties. That one will be critical as well in any evaluation of other properties.
And what's the significance of the words at the end of that subparagraph, or is part of a unique business opportunity? What would that mean?
I would have to consult with the consultant on that. That is, I believe, language from them, so we'd have to determine what exactly that means. I do know there are some references to tourist areas and things like that. I don't know if that's all somehow connected or based on previous public consultation, but we will follow up with the consultant. I believe he is no longer online, but we can follow up and provide that response.
So if as an example, staff were to contemplate that this type of change of use could be implemented by minor variance, and you recommend that, these two subparagraphs would be initially interpreted by staff to determine whether or not it's a minor variance or a zoning change.
Correct, in a sense that one of the four tests of a minor variance is to ensure that the general intent of the official plan is being met. So a part of that would be any policy related to short-term rentals. If this was implemented, the general intent of this official plan policy would have to be met even through a minor variance application.
Right, but in this particular case, if it was a minor variance, it would be staff that would be interpreting whether there is minimal or no disruption to neighboring properties, which is the wording of subparagraph A, as opposed to council making that determination.
I guess it would be staff that would prepare a report in a similar way that staff would prepare a report through the zoning amendment process to council, and it would be up to the committee of adjustment members to make that final determination if the variance route was an option that was afforded to these residents.
My understanding is that when staff has to make an initial determination as to whether an application that's being presented by a property owner should be processed as a minor variance or as a zoning amendment. And unless, and I think this is one of the challenges in determining what an expedited process looks like, if there's going to be an expedited process. Is it going to be, does that mean minor variance? And if it means minor variance, that means staff is doing the interpreting. That means that council doesn't see this application at all. That's my understanding.
That could be a potential outcome if the official plan amendment could be worded in such a way to steer away from minor variances, or it could be left open-ended to still allow for that as an option. Ultimately, I believe Councillor Noyes said that it's any property's right to make any application before either the Committee of Adjustment or Council. So any member of the public would be able to make an application for a minor variance even if staff encourage them to go a different route for, and that would be similar to any zoning bylaw amendment that comes before council. At some point in time, either the applicant or staff would provide some guidance on if it is indeed minor, if it's a minor variance, or if it should be elevated to a zoning amendment.
I don't have a problem with a member of the public, a property owner, being able to make an application, whether staff supports it or not. The concern that I would have is that if an application is brought forward, or if a pre-consultation meeting is held, which it would have to for this type of process, that at the pre-consultation stage, staff's wheels are then starting to turn in terms of, is this a minor variance? Is this a zoning bylaw amendment? Isn't that the way the process works?
Correct. I believe I can defer to the director because I know there's been some process changes as of late when it comes to pre-consultation.
And I think your answers have been excellent. I want to compliment you on your demeanor and your responsiveness to the questions. So I know I'm getting into an area where I think now we should get the director of planning engaged too, because so you may have a seat.
Really good.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So, Ms. Delwaria, you've been listening. I think you understand what my concern might be, and if not, I can articulate it even further. we have a pre-consultation process for anybody who wants to make a change in use of property, correct?
Yes, Your Worship, I understand the question. So at the pre-consultation, we would be deciding, based on the information that we have, whether it's a minor variance process or a zoning amendment. To give you an example, like what Mr. Borman was mentioning earlier, that if it's a property is on one side of R2B zone, in that situation, the neighborhood has a precedent of short-term rental, then it may go through a minor variance process. However, if it's a standalone STR, which do not have any STRs in the vicinity, then it might be a zoning amendment application. So each application would be evaluated based on its own merits. At this point, it's difficult for us to, for staff to mention whether it's going to be a minor variance or a zoning amendment. Maybe there could be a third option, which could be a minor zoning amendment application. So we would be evaluating those options. Like, this has been a very important discussion and a very useful discussion from staff perspective. We'll take it back and we will come back with a resolution.
Well, I think you hit on the direction I was going, which is the distinction that we have for a minor zoning amendment or a major one. There's a difference in the fees and there's a difference in the processing. Because when you make the determination as to whether this should be a minor variance or a zoning amendment, you've got your 4 criteria. This zoning bylaw amendment, if it were carried, now provides some additional things for you to be considering as a staff member. And my question would be, is it appropriate for staff or is it appropriate for council to be determining whether or not there's disruption to neighboring properties, or there's a compelling reason to permit the STR, or there's a unique business opportunity? Is that our responsibility or is that your responsibility? And when it comes to, that's a rhetorical question. So you don't have to answer that. But when it comes to the minor variance, the concern that I have is if the public has no right of appeal, then we have basically allocated to staff the responsibility for making these decisions, which, in my view, the responsibility is best left with council, because we're the people who are responsible to the public. You're responsible to us, and you're also responsible to the public. I don't want to diminish that. But I think in terms of who should be taking responsibility for the decisions that are made as to what is happening in our community ultimately should rest with us. And if it's a minor variance, that doesn't happen. It rests with people that we've appointed to a committee. They're all extremely competent people, and they get good advice from staff. But that would be the concern that I would have. Do you have any comments on that? That's my question, Councillor Noyes.
Your Worship,
Oh, no, I'm a little more sophisticated than that.
I agree with the concerns that you have outlined. Minor variance is, yes, there are 2 processes by which we can add a land use, which is minor variance and zoning amendment. Minor variance, I would be a little bit hesitant because it's a public process, but only the owner has the right to appeal. The public, in general, would not be able to appeal. So if there is something that we have that we have given approval for, even though the members of public would be involved in the process, but they do not have a right to appeal. But zoning amendment, they would have a right to appeal. So they would have more say in the process. But staff would be evaluating all these concerns and would take back which is the best process to add a land use, whether it's a minor variance or a minor zoning amendment or a full-fledged zoning amendment application.
Thank you. And if we did go through zoning amendment, the process for minor amendment is, I believe, quite streamlined.
Yes, so the process for a minor zoning amendment and a major zoning amendment would be the same. The time frame would be the same. It will be just maybe we can have a reduced fee, or we can take the information and recommendation the same night just to expedite the process. Those are the things that we can look into. Typically, if major zoning amendment is when it's a 2-step process, information at one meeting, recommendation at the second meeting. But in this situation, we can take one report, we can have a reduced fee to help the owner of the property. So we can look into different options. But like I said, we need to do a little bit more homework before we conclude which is the best process.
Right, but the minor zoning amendment application is a lesser fee and does result in a report an information and recommendation to council at the same time.
As of now, I'm thinking that could be one of the options. That's the way that we can have a win-win situation with the applicant and council as well.
Right. Okay, thank you. Those are my questions. Anyone else? Before I go back, Councillor Lewis?
Thank you, Your Worship. And yeah, just a couple of comments, and certainly not going to speak to too many of the issues that have already been addressed by some of my other colleagues. Certainly the parking issue, I think we need to absolutely look back into, as well as the number of bedrooms. I've struggled with that whole concept right from the very beginning. The other part that I just wanted to offer some comments on, I do understand, may not agree completely with the previous council's direction in terms of moving forward with a cap and actually this whole process to some degree. But it is what it is, and it will be what it will be. The cap that we currently have, and we've now filled up to the 250, my understanding was that if we were going through the zoning and official plan process, the reason for going through that official plan and zoning process was you either need a cap to keep the STRs in check and the number of them that we're going to have in the community, or we have a zoning and official plan process that deals with where do we want them and where don't we want them, and what is the process for dealing with the unique circumstances that we may have overlooked when doing the official plan or zoning process creation. So I'm a bit confused why we would go through the process of having an official plan, a zoning bylaw amendment, and then still consider having a cap. So I just wanted to throw that out there for comments. I am, you asked some very good questions, Your Worship, and I agree with those are on the expedited process, because I think we do have to have some process in place, and I appreciate the director's clarity and the report that will be coming back. I am supporting the information report tonight. At the last meeting, when we moved forward with WSP's report, I did have a motion on the floor to deal with the waterfront properties, because I do think some waterfront properties, and we know where they are for the most part, have historically been cottages and cottage rentals in some capacity or another. And those areas are predominantly between, Holloway Bay Road and the Peace Bridge and the Thunder Bay, Oak Hill Forest, kind of traditional areas of cottages in Fort Erie. So I'll certainly take some of those conversations off record, offline with staff, and do appreciate the work that has been done to date. One question I do want to ask, and I just want to confirm, WSP, the consultants that attended virtually this meeting as well as the last meeting, did I hear correctly that they are not here for the discussion related to the report that they've been hired to look after? And I just want to make sure that my hearing is correct.
Ms. Dewari, do you have any knowledge of that?
Your Worship, can Councillor repeat that question?
Yeah, I was just asking if WSP, the consultants that we've retained for this process, if they are still in the virtual waiting room or not, and if they have made an attempt to try and get back.
Question is, why weren't they here? We were told by Mr. Bender
Or they
that
may be here.
he was asked not to be, that they didn't need to be present.
Your Worship, that's not correct. We had requested the WSP, the consultant, to attend in person, but it could be because of the budget that we have, and it would be working out more expensive for them to be in person, but the request was made to the consultant to attend in person.
Thank you. And if I can clarify, maybe the director doesn't have this answer, but is WSP still in the waiting room virtually?
Mr. Patton?
And if they are not, have they tried to rejoin?
Okay, so they're not there now. Okay.
Perfect. And thank you for the clarity on that. And where I want to go with this is I have some major concerns with the consultants that's been retained. The last two meetings where a report has come forward, we have not had them here, which I do not think myself is acceptable. Maybe certain members of council do, but I do believe we're paying a good buck for this consultant's report, and it is an incredibly important issue to people on all sides of the issue, and I'm quite disappointed with that. I'm also a little bit concerned that WSP will also be doing our official plan review. And I don't know about the rest of council, but I'm certainly not looking for a Zoom official plan review. So I just want to make those remarks very clear tonight. And quite look forward to the staff report on where we go from here.
Thank you, Councillor Lewis. Ms. Dewar, do you have any further comments with respect to the comments made by Councillor Lewis regarding the consultant's presence or absence?
Your Worship, only thing that I can mention is that we tried to speak with the consultant and express them that they should be in attendance, but however, we were not able to get them here. But we can make an effort when we are giving the recommendation report so they can be in attendance in person.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Councillor Dubanow.
Yeah, thank you very much, Your Worship. And Councillor Lewis actually touched on much of the same concerns that I've had. Not so much the process and the way we're doing this here at council. I think we're doing our best in the circumstances with the challenge that we're facing. But I do have lots of concerns about the consultants. Some of the things I've seen on their screen, not being in attendance here, some of the comments earlier when that was asked, and now we're hearing differently from staff. Even some of the earlier revisions of reports that we've seen in PDS, just lots of concern. And one of the things that, you comment, a common refrain, and it's one I find myself often having to defend is, consultants. And, one of the ways that I try to defend that is, we try to get value for our money and we try to get good work out of the consultants we retain. And I'm not sure I can say that right now. I may be wrong, but that's the impression I have. I will allow WSP at a point in the future to change my mind. That's for them to do, and they will have the opportunity to do that. But through you, Your Worship, I've raised this concern with Ms. Deloria in the past, and I'm just wondering if perhaps she has some information. How much has WSP billed taxpayers so far for the work they've done? For the municipality. I'm wondering if we have that information, either Ms. Deloria or perhaps even Mr. Jansen or the CAO.
Ms. Dewar, would you know that offhand?
I do, Your Worship. So the project was budgeted for 70,000. As of now, the project is at 61,000.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Your Worship.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop, and hearing everyone's comments, and I'm glad to see that we're working so well together to kind of come to some conclusion, even though we may not all be in agreement with everything. One question that was raised by one of the speakers was regarding our legal opinion in regards to current non-conforming use being grandfathered in. I do remember that we had a fairly detailed report from our legal representative to say that yes, we would kind of be in a quandary if we didn't recognize what was in there because we had no zoning. So I don't know if that's going to kind of be addressed again or if we're really confident that the information that we got a while ago from our legal representative is still okay, because I'm fine with our current definition of what basically non-conforming gets grandfathered in. But I just didn't want to lose that, it's kind of that position has been challenged, I guess, by one of the speakers. The other thing is in regards to minor variances, the minor variance, I think I understand what the Director of Planning has said, and in regards to that, we're going to kind of meet in the middle, that council will still have some input into this, because my understanding of minor variance is like, okay, the zoning requires 30 feet, you got 29 feet, your fence is 7 point, well, I guess that's not zoning, but, it's usually very mathematical, like 2.5 to 2 or something like that. And I also see in a minor variance, you get an orange sign on your property and say, okay, this is what the owner is asking for, and you have 15 days to respond, and this is the meeting. So I'm not quite sure, but as long as I think council does need to be involved in it somewhat, as opposed to leaving it up to a committee. The other thought I wanted to bring about the moratorium, I agree somewhat with Councillor Lewis in regards to, we've gone through this process, that we should have some recommendation from either council or from staff, or a recommendation from staff, how we move forward from the 250 cap. I don't say you open the doors and there is no cap, but I do think that there needs to be some suggestion on how we move forward from the 250, whether it's 300, and then see how that goes, and then the following year, a few more, or whatever, but some recommendation on how we move forward. I wouldn't remove the cap altogether, but I definitely would see increasing it, and as things work out, I think we'll get to the point that Council Lewis wants to be in. Particularly, I don't think owner-occupied short-term rentals should be included in that cap. Okay, so they should be over here, so they're not included in the cap number. And the last thing I want to mention is, many of you weren't here during the RV discussions, where people were parking their RVs on the road simply because they really had no place else to park them, and of course neighbors were upset. And we did come to a middle ground that I think I have not heard one complaint since, and I know it happened in my ward, is that we came up to, and this is where I'm going for the owner-occupied, there has to be some leniency. What we decided for the RV is that they could park it on the road so many times, for so many days, so many times per year. And I think we decided they could do it 3 times per year for 3 days. But anything over that would not be allowed. And the neighbors were well informed of that. And if that RV was there for 4 days, I'm sure we would have heard about it. So I'm not saying that's the solution, like the number of days and number of times, but that's how we solved the RV problem. And I don't recall having another issue with RVs being parked in a resident, like on the street, so to speak, when we came up with that solution. It seemed to have worked quite well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Noyes. Anyone else? So just to respond to the questions you raised, the legal opinion, that's something that I would ask the CAO and the Director of Planning to discuss to see whether there's anything further that we need to do. In terms of the minor variance process, staff is committed to look at the various options, and they'll come back. Your comments, I think, are clear. Council has no role in minor variances, none. Okay, if there are no other questions, then I'm going to call the question on this report. All those in favor of the recommendations, none opposed, that is carried. We are going to go to planning and development, but before we go there, we're going to take a 10-minute break. we're gonna come back in session, and we're going to planning and development, and that's you, Councillor Dubanow.
Yes, it is, Your Worship. Planning and Development Services is in session for the evening. We have no delegations or presentations this evening. However, we have one report, and that report is PDS 60-2023 for the 726 Gorham Road subdivision agreement. Can I get a mover for that? Councillor McDermott. That report is now on the floor for any questions or comments from council. Councillor Noyes?
Thank you, Councillor Dubanow. My question is actually about, I brought it up when this came forward, and I'm going to support this, but my question at that time too, were the people across the street, they're going to have to hook up to water and sewer, my understanding. They're not going to have any choice, right? When the water's brought back along here, yes?
I believe they have to, but Ms. Del Wario, or maybe even Mr. Walsh, depending on which wheelhouse this falls into, might be able to give you clarification on that.
Without looking at the bylaw specifically, Councillor Dubanow, I do not have that answer right now, but I think so.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Councillor Noyes?
Yeah, I think that was the answer during the thing, is that, yes, they would have to hook up because it would pass their houses, would be on the opposite side of the road. I'm just wondering, I asked that question at the time in regards to what it would cost, and I guess my question is still that, in regards to, I don't think it's cheap. And I think there's 2, if not 3 houses that are involved with this. Could there be any flexibility in regards to the cost from the town? Like, do they have 2 years to pay or 3 years to hook up? Some information that we can tell them?
So, and just, oh, Your Worship, yeah, actually, did you want to comment on that before I went to Mr.?
I think maybe Jonathan might have.
Oh, okay, sorry, I apologize. Mr. Jansen, did you have something? The mayor was pointing at you, so you're the money guy.
No, can you repeat the question?
Councillor Noyes?
Okay, if you have to hook up to water and sewer, and you currently have a septic system, but now the water and sewer is now going in front of your house because of a new development, you now have to hook into it. Any idea what the cost for that would be? And is there any way that it can be kind of like made a little bit less difficult? Like, can they do it in installments, or does it all have to be all at once, or what's the timeline for them to pay to get it hooked up?
I'm going to go to Mr. Jansen to see if he has something, but I'm going to then go to Mr. Walsh after you get some clarification. Mr. Jansen, is there something you wanted to provide?
No, I don't have the actual connection charges available. They would be responsible, according to our policies, to be paying the monthly charges, including the fixed charges. But in terms of the connection itself, I don't have that amount here.
And if I may, Councillor Noyes, just to expand on that, because that's a good question. Mr. Walsh, are they responsible for paying for the entire connection to municipal infrastructure, or are they only required to pay for their lateral on their side of the property, and then we pay for the connection on the municipal side?
They're responsible for everything, and just through my recollection, they have to hook up. No, actually, they don't have to hook up, but they have to start paying base charges within a year. At the end of a year.
So if we understand this correctly, they still have to pay for the sewer charge within 1 year, even if they haven't paid to connect yet. Is that our understanding? Okay. Councillor Noyes?
So just one clarification, so they don't have to hook up? Ever?
That's correct. But they have to pay base charges.
But they're paying for the infrastructure even if they're not connected to it.
So they're paying the $71 or whatever it is per month. Okay, interesting.
I guess that's a decision for them to make then. Was there anything else, Councillor Noyes? Any other members of council have any questions or comments? So I'm seeing none. I'll call the question then. All those in favor? That's unanimous. Thank you. We have no additional reports. Do any members of council have any new business or inquiries they'd like to raise this evening? Seeing none, any questions or comments regarding the business status report? Well, that was a quick one, Your Worship. I hand the chair back to you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dubanow. That takes us to infrastructure services, Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. Infrastructure Services is now in session. There are no presentations or delegations. There are no reports. Any new business inquiries? Seeing none, that brings us to the business status report. Any questions? Seeing none, I turn the chair back over to Mayor Redekop.
Thank you very much, Councillor Noyes. That is the new record. We're going to go to Corporate and Community Services, Councillor McDermott, but before we go there, is there any reason why we would have not had the corporate and community services ahead of the other two in view of the fact that we've got a delegation here? Would you know that, CAO or clerk?
I'll take through the chair. I think we were looking at making those changes, and I think it was dependent on the number of people in the gallery this evening for the short-term rental. And I think it was left that it seemed that there would be less of a crowd and less of a duration for waiting. But otherwise, we would have made that recommendation.
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering why we wouldn't have had corporate and community services ahead of planning and infrastructure since, anyways, I'm just prolonging the time that she's here. Councillor McDermott.
Thank you, Worship. Corporate and Community Services is now in session. We have a presentation. So, Ms. Bradham, we'll be talking about the strategic initiatives.
Sorry, it's on.
I did offer to stay and not have it switched because they were going to ask you, but I
Because you're such a
took one for the team.
Because you were so interested in.
I was actually very interested. And Garrett, you did do a good job. Yes, please. Okay, and then just page down. Oh. Yeah, if you can do full screen and from the beginning. Oh, that's good. You can leave it right there. So thank you for allowing me this opportunity to provide council with the results of the public consultation that was undertaken on the draft 2023-2026 Corporate Strategic Plan between July 25th and August 11th. Social media was used to distribute the survey, and 314 businesses and 75 community organizations were sent direct invitations to provide feedback. We only received 149 survey responses, and of those, 84% acknowledged that they lived in Fort Erie or owned a business. And as you can see from the graphic that I included, every ward was represented. Some a little bit more than others, but pretty equal across the board. Of those that completed the survey, 40 individuals did provide me with their email addresses so that they could be kept apprised of the progress of the plan. The report was sent directly to them as soon as it was made public, and 3 individuals did provide additional responses to me, which I appreciated. I also had the opportunity last week to present the draft report to the Fort Erie Service Provider Network. There were approximately 25 organizations that were in attendance through the Zoom meeting, and they really appreciated receiving that as well. We're very excited about some of the council initiatives. So this slide represents the survey results for Council's vision statement, which reads, Fort Erie, a community for everyone. Respondents were asked if the vision statement represented what they wanted the community to be, the future state. 88% agreed with the vision statement, and of those, 14% stated that they agreed but felt something was missing. And all of those comments are included in Appendix 1 to the report with staff commentary. When considering this vision statement, Council felt that it captured all that the town aspired to be and ties in with those strategic objectives, which all begin with a community that or a community where. For the mission statement, to lead and serve Fort Erie by fostering opportunities, leveraging partnerships, and managing our resources to achieve prosperity, 82% of residents agreed with the mission statement. Felt it clearly described our unique purpose and contribution and helped clarify the practical aspect of accomplishing the vision. 12% of those that agreed with the mission statement also felt some things were missing, and 15 comments were received. Those comments are also included in Appendix 1 to the report. Respondents were asked about the 6 key pillars that Council identified as the most important strategies to address during this term of Council: the sustainable, reliable access to local health care, quality of life and community well-being, sustainable and managed growth, economic prosperity and diversification, environmental and climate change resiliency, and comprehensive housing options. So 85% agreed that these 6 key pillars were very important. 14% agreed but felt something was missing, and again, 18 additional comments were received and commentaries included in the report. So respondents were asked if they agreed with Council's direction on those 6 key pillars. So for sustainable, reliable access to local health care, this was the highest ranking. 95% agreed with Council's direction. 26% of those in agreement provided additional comments, and they were mainly related to Douglas Memorial Hospital and the closure in 2028 that's imminent, and what that will mean for the community. For quality of life and community well-being, 85% agreed with Council's direction, and 23% of those in agreement provided additional comments. For sustainable and managed growth, 89% agreed with Council's direction. 31% of those that did respond provided additional comments as well, mainly related to balancing growth with protecting the environment. Some of the respondents recognized the economic benefits of growth, while others felt that it should be limited. Council's initiative to develop urban design guidelines, I think, will be very important and will help address a lot of the concerns that were shared. For the economic prosperity and diversification, 88.5% agreed, with 17% of those in agreement providing additional comments. For environmental and climate change resiliency, 87% agreed with Council's direction, and 20% of those in agreement provided additional comments, again related to balancing growth with protecting the natural areas we have in town. I think it's very important that with the 22 acres of riparian land that we just obtained, the lands adjacent to the Burnt Mill Nature Club, that goes a long way with showing Council's commitment to nature and preservation. And it's quite evident that a climate change plan, action plan, really needs to be a priority for the community. For comprehensive housing options, 88% agreed with Council's direction. 23% of those in agreement provided additional comments, many of which related to confirming the need for affordable and attainable homes. So when asked if there were any key strategies or actions missing, 42 comments were received, many stating that they had no further comments and felt that Council's plan was very comprehensive. Some of the comments that were received were operational in nature, and staff commentary has provided responses to them in the report as well, dealing with infrastructure, parks upgrades, things like that, specific to those. Other comments are related to, again, balancing the growth and preserving green space, questioning if there's sufficient staff to undertake the work related to growth and Council's strategic focus, concerns shared about democracy and the threats to democracy, the need to create high-paying jobs, and transit service levels that impact those that depend on transit as their main source of transportation. And the last slide outlines the next steps in the process. So hopefully tonight the report will be passed and the adoption of the bylaw will take place next Monday. Working with our communication staff, we're going to then create a dedicated webpage. I know Kevin's been working on it already with tiles, and the key pillars and initiatives will be in there. The CAO and myself will meet with staff departmentally to review Council's focus and show them where they fit into the plan and the work that they will be expected to do to help us achieve success. The CAO and directors will also meet with me to confirm the champions for each and the measurements. The measurements are very high level, and that's some of the comments that were included in the survey responses. And so those will be drilled down when we meet with those staff champions. We'll capture the data as of today and what that will look like at the end of the term and what that success will look like. And then we will be providing reports on a fairly regular basis to monitor the progress of the initiatives, and we'll be providing updates to Council, and they'll be based on red, yellow, green. As the CAO has mentioned before, it'll be a quick snapshot dashboard to show where we're at and what needs extra work and extra attention. And that is it.
Thank you, Ms. Bradman. Are there any comments or questions? Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Councillor McDermott. I just wanted to thank Ms. Bradman for all her, and the CEO for all the hard work on that very nice report. It's nice to see that the community that did participate, and we always would like more, but those that did participate, I think, are a good reflection of the rest of the town. And it seems that they do feel that we're going in the right direction. But thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
Councillor Flagg?
Thank you, Chair. And I will echo the comments on the outstanding work by the team that put this together. The one comment, and I shared with you in an email earlier on page
16, I think?
16 of the responses, and it talks about the EV charging infrastructure, and one of the staff comments is that currently there are no EV charging stations, and we've had that conversation that there are indeed some, just not on town property. So that just one of the comments, but you know, certainly not to overshadow anything else within the plan.
And thank you for letting me clarify that, because it was public facilities. I was thinking of the libraries, you know, our Leisureplex, our Crystal Ridge Arena, the Town Hall, and the mayor mentioned today that the Niagara Parks also has, at the Old Fort, has EV stations. So that'll all go into that climate action plan too, when we look at adaptation, resiliency, and mitigation strategies, how that's going to unfold. Thank you.
Your worship?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Ms. Bradman, for a really concise report and for all the work that you put into this, along with the CAO. I want to compliment you as well on your tact in response to some of the comments that we received. Of the 314 businesses and 75 organizations, how many of the 149 responses came from that group?
It was anonymous, so unless they provided me with their emails, I wouldn't know that. We kept it open-ended. Just the question was, do you live in town, own a business, and then if you want to provide your email address.
Right, and of the 149, I think you said 16% didn't reside in town?
Yeah, it was 84% that did, so yeah, 125 approximately.
And about 23 that didn't, which means out of the town residents, we've got about 126 respondents. And of the 40 that indicated, that did provide you with an email address, were you able to determine which of those were from town and which ones weren't?
No, I could go back and look at the surveys to figure it out, because I can do it independently, but.
And of those 40, were you able to match up any of them with the 314 and 75 that were specifically requested?
There were probably about 10 businesses and probably about 12 community organization staff members, not so much, you know, board members or not on behalf of the community organizations, but the names I did recognize.
Which would be difficult.
Yep.
Okay, so that's helpful in terms of, I guess, showing who took the time. Some of the responses I thought were quite perceptive. Councillor Flagg, you mentioned one, and there were some others, some related to business, what have you. Some were just, I was gonna. That's good. That's well I'm just trying to, for example, and this was probably the same person who banged on this drum 2 or 3 times about the town of Fort Erie should stop selling waterfront to developers. Okay, I don't want to hazard a guess where that would have come from. Since I've been on council, beginning in the early 90s, I know that the town of Fort Erie has never disposed of waterfront land, and in fact has picked up a number of parcels, beginning with the beach at Crystal Beach when the Tennis and Yacht Club was approved, continuing with the acquisition of the Rebstock property, which then made that a larger beach, continuing with a 900 linear foot parcel at the bottom of Burley Road that had sheeted to the crown and was picked up by the town for $0 in the around 2003, I think, 2002, 2003. Continuing on with the hockey stick little parcel where the North Shore Drive new subdivision is located that we picked up when that plan was approved. And continuing on through to the most recent donation by Mr. Costabelli at Harborfront. So that those are all new. Plus, during that period of time, and Councillor Noyes, you were here in those days, we, and Councillor Lewis, you might have been here near the end, but we started working on improving the waterfront road allowances. So it's hard to imagine how far off one could be. There was, I know, some consternation about nature, heritage, and one comment that we should stop approving subdivisions, which is quite beyond our ability. But I think the flip of that was the concern about the natural heritage. And while I think the problem that some people fail to recognize is that property owners do have some rights. We can restrict rights to a great extent through legislative documents that we're permitted to implement, like an official plan, like a zoning bylaw. There's also the Ministry of Environment, there's the Ministry of Natural Resources, there's the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, all of whom can place restrictions on what you can do on your property and what you can't do. But, you know, we've had an official plan in Fort Erie in one way or another since prior to the town becoming within its current boundaries in 1970. And that official plan and the zoning bylaw that followed would have designated where people can build houses. And it's within our urban boundary. And so there are all this to say that it may look easy when we sit up here. It's a lot more complicated than it appears. And so we're doing our very best to make sure that we do protect the natural environment. There's nothing that says that we can't do better, and we're trying. I tell people now, and I have no qualms whatsoever, this is the most environmentally sensitive council that the town of Fort Erie has ever had. And this may be the most environmentally sensitive council in Niagara, period.
I agree.
We are undoubtedly one of the few municipalities, maybe the only, that has actually acquired natural heritage lands, such as we did in the property adjacent to Shagbark Trail, at a significant sum of money, but added to our natural heritage. So that was a little curious. The message to me, after I read some of the comments, I was a little taken aback. But I guess the highlight from the message is that you can never do enough communication. So that, and you know, younger people here would know that. That's part of your life. You communicate. But that's the message. If we're going to make sure that people understand what we're doing, we just need to continuously get out what it is we're doing. And Cole Patton and Kevin Beauchamp, that's their job. I think they're doing an excellent job. They're ratcheting up the amount of information that gets out there. They're continuously looking for information that they can provide to the public. We've got the upgrades to our website, which are very important. But having said that, I've also come to the conclusion that you can put information in front of people, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll take it. It's like taking the horse to water. You can get them there, but they may not want to drink. And maybe there's some comfort in not drinking the water because maybe you're comfortable with your view of the world. All that to say that I appreciate the comments that were made. There were, in a community of 33,500 people, 149 responses isn't a lot, but it can be revealing, and it shouldn't be regarded by us as saying, well, nobody else responded, they must be completely happy. No, that's not the case. A lot of them aren't paying attention because they're living their own lives. Some of them will be happy. They think we're doing a fine job. We hear that periodically. I hope you hear that periodically. The criticism is easier for people to make, but a lot of these comments weren't critical. They were constructive in nature, and also some of them were complimentary. But these are great challenges for us. The one about democracy, I did get an email, I did respond, a bit higher level than maybe some of you also received the email from the individual. Yeah, legitimate concerns and things that I think really kind of fit into one pillar or the other. The one thing that I would ask, and the report makes reference to staff champions, I would really ask councillors to consider the possibility of becoming a champion of one of the pillars, the pillar that appeals to you the most. I'm going to be trying to champion all of them, but it would be nice if we had a council champion for each one. And as the report suggests, if that's what we do, see that through, no matter what committee you might end up on going forward. But if you're particularly high on healthcare, pick healthcare and stick with it till the end. If you're interested in infrastructure, pick it, stick to the end, or what have you. So those are my comments. I'm very much appreciative that we're where we are. And yes, it took us a little while to get here, but we've got a blueprint. This will guide us on our budget, it'll guide us on our infrastructure, and it'll guide us in our responsibilities to the public. So thank you, Ms. Bradnam, and all the staff who participated in this, and the councillors for coming up with great ideas. Thank you.
Are there any further questions of Ms. Bradnam? The only thing I'll add on to that before I come is that misinformation is so much more fun than the information that we have out there. And that's why, our goal should always be to be in front of that. And sometimes it's so difficult because it's so exciting to read. Not so truthful, but exciting nevertheless.
I wanted to be
Christensen?
transparent, so they provided comments, so, yeah.
I've spoken with Ms. Bradnam about this. And I guess my question is whether there's a possibility to tweak some of the measures, and I zeroed in on performance measures at this point, at this late date, under quality of life and community well-being, and I wanted to throw it out there. As all of you know, I worked on an initiative that was looking at a community hub, so a center where there would be facilities for children, youth, seniors, an overall vision. About 4 years ago, COVID put paid to forward momentum, but I noticed in the responses, and I did mention it in the strat planning that I thought that something like that needed to be in our plan. And when I looked at the measures afterward, I thought we needed something more specific, particularly when I saw, I think it's comment number 20, and there are a few others scattered through there, under quality of life and community well-being, related to the fact that we have some fine resources, we are adding to them, but the idea of a community center with programming, different from what we have, different from the hockey, different from the events coordination that occurs at the Leisureplex and Crystal Ridge. So I'm talking about programming. And one of the thoughts that I've thought of, this is all under, I'm asking the question, can we do this in a boiled down way? We talk about the parks the parks and facilities master plan. Programming has come up. It came up when I was campaigning. I have a lot of new families in my ward, and they're looking for things their kids can do. We have certain things, but we don't necessarily have certain types of after-school activities, especially for kids who can't stay in the school or whatever. that old idea of a community hub kept coming back, and I wondered if we could add something under the performance measures that relates to enhancing the parks and facilities master plan to include programming, to include an assessment of the physical facilities we actually have in the town, sort of a count, basically, not quality, but just where are they? You know, we know Crystal Ridge, the Leisuroplex, add in privately owned and operated, the Beachcombers, Douglas Heights, E.J. Freeland, some of the others where there are churches that have certain potential for activity. To start to document that, go back to the survey that was done in 2018, see if we could even update that and see what, because now, you know, one of the big things was healthcare and medical. Well, we've separated that as a separate pillar for this strat plan. So take that out, take out the pharmacies in the West End, because we've got 2 new ones, one coming and one just opened. But if there was a way to add to the performance measure that spoke to something around a commitment to taking a look at this and improving it. It's a big job, but it's something that I think would help benefit our students and stuff. So is it possible to do that? Ms. Bradnam.
Through you, Chair, to Councillor Christensen. Actually, the third bullet under our measurements does say increase in number of publicly available community recreational programs for seniors, adults, and children, both in summer and winter. Okay. And so when we drill that down with staff, we can take into account, because I really love participating with you on that community hub initiative, so I do have that documentation, so we would use that as a tool. So it kind of is in there, it's just not as detailed, but as I said, these are high level, so we can include that with that.
And there is just, I'm just going to say, the Strongford Erie neighborhoods did some work on the north end and east end of town as well. So,
and they actually just requested during that Fort Erie Service Providers Network, that listing that I have. So I'm going to be sending that over to them as well.
So that was a long-winded thing. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, could somebody move the report for me? Okay, thanks. Any comments or questions to the report? Councillor Dubanow.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is more of a comment, having had the opportunity to have some of these discussions earlier. I just want to thank town staff for the work that they did on this, the outreach, the work with council, the work with senior staff. Ms. Bradnam is been the champion of this. She's done all this work. It's the second one since I've been on council that she's been involved in. Mr. McQueen as well was very instrumental, as everyone else involved in this. I mentioned earlier tonight how, you know, I at least anyway, hear from residents, you know, about how we bring in consultants, or at least they perceive how we bring in consultants to do everything. This is a good example of where we used our own in-house talent. Ms. Bradnam, Mr. McQueen, or the rest of our staff, where they came together and worked with council and our senior staff and everyone else in the community to put together this plan. So as much as I raised that issue earlier tonight about the consultants on one side of things, this is an example of how we have, when we have that talent available and we have those staff resources available to us, we do utilize our staff in this way, and they provide us with fantastic work. I'm very happy with this. I will be taking up the Mayor's Challenge. I will be, there's one that I have some interest in, and I'm going to be looking forward and hopefully having an opportunity to carry that through. I hope other council members do. And the commentary was fantastic. The mayor's right. Sometimes you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But at least you led him to the water, and you're giving him an opportunity to drink. And that's what we need to continue doing. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to comment. And I'm finally going to close my mouth for once. So thank you very much.
Oh, no, that's not going to happen. Councillor Noyes.
Just a question, how do we go about choosing who's going to champion each one?
Your worship?
Yeah, I'm going to suggest that you all send me an email with your preferred category, and if there's duplicates, then we'll have to sort that out. But
Can I suggest that people have two choices, like primary and secondary, like, I prefer A.
we could also go by seniority on council.
I agree with that.
Which,
That's a great idea.
I actually do now too.
Yeah. Well, Councillor McDermott, of course, goes along with that. I mean, so,
Do they have to be consecutive terms?
well, so actually, as it turns out, it doesn't make any difference because Councillor McDermott was here since 2014. I think you and Councillor Dubanow came in 2018. So you would have some seniority because of previous service.
That's what I meant, doesn't have to be concurrent, right?
Okay, so, yeah, that's a good suggestion. Send me your top two preferences, and then we can go from there.
Well, I think Joan should have the number 2, the well-being one, personally.
So are there any more comments or questions to the report?
That's a good question.
Isn't that a good question? I thought it was. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Carried. Are there any new business inquiries? And my favorite, the business status report. How exciting was that for you? Nothing? Okay. Back to you, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, Councillor McDermott. There are no closed session items. Scheduling of meetings. Councillor Noyes and then Dubanow.
Yes, there is a traffic coordinating meeting this Wednesday at 12 p.m. in Committee Room 1.
That's September 13th.
Just the same day as stepping out.
What time did you say that was?
Noon?
Councillor Dubanow.
Yeah, Your Worship, the various heritage committees will be meeting on Wednesday here at Town Hall at 1 p.m. I don't have a committee room assignment yet. I'm going to assume, as it always is, in either committee room 1 or 2.
Okay, and that's this Wednesday. Any other meetings? Councillor Lewis.
Your Worship, Crystal Beach Business Improvement Association, 6 p.m., the Ridgeway Arena on Wednesday, or Ridgeway Library.
13th? Crystal Ridge Library. Okay, any other meetings? If not, Councillor Dubanow.
Yes, Your Worship, I'd like to move that council and committee adjourn at 8:57 p.m. this evening.
All those in favor? Unanimous again. Great.